I came home in the freezing Chicago rain to find my 71-year-old wife's life stuffed into 6 black trash bags on the front porch. My daughter-in-law was inside drinking wine with a contractor pointing at where my favorite chair used to sit. She smiled at me and said she shipped my wife to a state-run facility because they needed the space for their new life. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch. I just picked up my wife's oxygen tank, walked back out into the rain, and started a war they had no idea how to fight. Before I tell you exactly how I made them regret the day they were born, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders should come with severe consequences. Let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon. I am Warren. I am 73 years old. I spent 40 years pulling double shifts at the steel mill on the south side of Chicago, and before that I spent my youth sweating in the jungles of Vietnam. My bones ache when the temperature drops, but you do what you have to do for the people you love. My wife Gloria had a stroke 6 months ago. She is a fighter, but the stroke left her weak on her left side, needing constant care and a machine to help her breathe at night. I had just driven to the pharmacy on 43rd Street to pick up her blood pressure medication. The rain was coming down in sheets, freezing as soon as it hit the windshield of my old Ford truck. I pulled into my driveway expecting to see the porch light on. Instead, the porch was dark, but it was not empty. I put the truck in park and squinted through the wiping blades. There were 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags piled up right against the front door. I stepped out into the freezing downpour. My bad knee locked up, but I pushed through the pain. As I got closer, I noticed one of the bags was torn. Something shiny caught the dim light from the street lamp. I reached down the freezing rain, soaking through my heavy flannel shirt, and pulled the wet plastic back. It was our wedding album. 45 years of memories sitting in a puddle of muddy water. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I ripped the next bag open. Clothes. Gloria's favorite floral dresses, the ones I bought her for our anniversary, crammed in like filthy rags. Then I saw it. The green metal cylinder sticking out of the 3rd bag, her backup oxygen tank. Sitting right next to it in a clear plastic grocery sack were her daily pill organizers, the ones I carefully fill out every Sunday night, the medication she needs to keep her heart beating steadily. I did not use my key. I lifted my heavy steel-toed work boot, the same boots I wore on the mill floor, and kicked the front door right below the deadbolt. The wood splintered and the door flew open, slamming against the drywall. I stepped inside, dripping freezing rain onto the hardwood floor I installed with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. The house was warm, but the atmosphere was ice cold. The living room was completely torn apart. My recliner was gone. Gloria's knitting table was gone. Instead, there were paint swatches taped to the walls and a tall white man holding a clipboard standing in the center of the room. Sitting on my leather sofa, legs crossed, holding a glass of red wine, was Megan, my 36-year-old daughter-in-law. She did not even flinch when the door slammed open. She just took a sip of her wine and looked at me like I was the one trespassing in her home. "Look at the mess you are making, Warren," she said, sighing loudly. "We are going to have to get these floors refinished now." I ignored the contractor, who was slowly backing away toward the hallway. I looked dead into Megan's eyes. I asked her where my wife was. Megan smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was a smirk, the kind of look someone gives you when they think they hold all the cards and you are just a helpless old man. "She is gone." "Warren," she said smoothly. "I had a transport service come pick her up an hour ago. She is at Oak Creek Care now." I felt the blood rush to my ears. Oak Creek Care was a notorious state-run facility. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten, a place where the halls smelled like ammonia and neglect. You do not send a stray dog to Oak Creek, let alone a woman recovering from a massive stroke. Why, I asked, my voice dropping low and dangerously calm. "Because this house is Terrence's inheritance," she said, taking another sip of her expensive wine. "And frankly, we need the space now. We cannot have a sick old woman taking up the master bedroom while we are trying to build our future. Terrence deserves this house, and you two have just been dragging him down." She waved her hand dismissively at the front door. "You can pack whatever you want from the basement, but you need to be out by the end of the month." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, but I was not looking at her anymore. I was listening. I heard the faint scrape of a shoe against the kitchen tile. Terrence, my 42-year-old son, The boy I broke my back to put through college. The boy I taught how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to be a man. He was standing just out of sight behind the kitchen island. I walked slowly past Megan, my wet boots leaving dark, muddy footprints on the floor. I stopped at the edge of the kitchen. Terrence was standing by the sink, staring intently at the drain. He would not look up. He would not meet my eyes. "Terrence," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Look at me." His shoulders hitched, but he kept his head down. "Megan is right, Dad," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is too much for us. It is too much for you. She will be better off with professionals." He was a coward. A grown man hiding behind his greedy wife, letting her throw his own mother out into the literal trash. The betrayal was a physical weight, a sharp knife twisting right between my shoulder blades. He was choosing her greed over the woman who gave him life. He stood there letting a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life dictate the fate of the family that built everything he had. Any other man might have thrown a punch. Any other father might have grabbed him by the collar and shook him until his teeth rattled. But violence would only give them an excuse to call the police on a 73-year-old black man. And I had a much more pressing issue. Gloria did not have her oxygen. She did not have her blood pressure medication. She was alone, terrified, and medically vulnerable in a facility known for letting patients slip through the cracks and die in the dark. I did not say another word to my son. He was dead to me in that moment. I turned my back on him, walking past Megan, who was already pointing at the ceiling, talking to the contractor about installing recessed lighting. I walked back out into the freezing rain. I bent down beside the torn garbage bags on the porch. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from the pure, concentrated rage pumping through my veins. I picked up the heavy green oxygen cylinder. I grabbed the plastic bag full of her pill bottles. I left the clothes and the wedding album in the mud. I could replace clothes. I could not replace my wife. I threw the tank into the passenger seat of my truck and climbed behind the wheel. The engine roared to life. I put it in gear and backed out of the driveway, tires spinning on the wet pavement. I had to get to Oak Creek Care. I had to get Gloria out of that hellhole before the night was over. But as I sped through the dark Chicago streets, a cold realization washed over me. Megan had legally transferred her. Megan and Terrence must have signed some kind of paperwork to force her into state care. If I walked in there and tried to take her, they would call the cops, and I would be arrested for kidnapping my own wife. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned ash gray. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast, because I did not know if Gloria would survive the night without her medication. I drove my old Ford truck across the city while the freezing rain poured down. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the glass, pushing away the water, but they could not wash away the image burned into my mind. My wife's life tossed onto the porch like yesterday's garbage. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel. The tires slipped twice on the slick asphalt, but I kept my foot pressed heavy on the gas pedal. I knew exactly where Oak Creek Care was located. Everyone in Chicago knew about Oak Creek. It was the place where the state sent the forgotten people. A massive concrete building sitting on the edge of the industrial district, flanked by abandoned warehouses and cracked sidewalks. It was not a place of healing. It was a waiting room for the graveyard. I pulled into the visitor parking lot. The yellow streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, broken shadows across the wet pavement. I threw the truck into park and did not even bother locking the doors. I grabbed the heavy green oxygen tank from the passenger seat and tucked the plastic bag of Gloria's medication into my coat pocket. The freezing rain soaked my hair the second I stepped out, but I did not feel the cold. I only felt a burning urgency in my chest. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the facility. The smell hit me immediately. It was a thick, suffocating odor of cheap bleach-boiled cabbage and stale urine. The lobby was painfully bright, illuminated by harsh fluorescent tubes that hummed like angry hornets. The linoleum floor was scuffed and peeling in the corners. A single receptionist sat behind a thick sheet of plexiglass, staring blankly at a computer screen. She looked up as I approached her jaw, chewing slowly on a piece of gum. I did not wait for her to ask me what I wanted. "I am here for my wife," I told her, my voice echoing in the empty lobby. "Gloria Vance. She was brought here tonight." The receptionist slowly typed the name into her keyboard. Her eyes darted toward a man in a dark blue security uniform leaning against the far wall before looking back at me. "She is in the intake wing down hall C," the receptionist said, pointing a lazy finger to the left. "But visiting hours ended at 8. You cannot go back there." I ignored her. I walked past the desk, the heavy oxygen tank bumping against my leg with every step. "Hey, you cannot go back there!" The security guard called out, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. I kept walking. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors labeled Hall C and stepped into a nightmare. The hallway was lined with wheelchairs, people with hollow eyes and sunken cheeks slumped over in the dim lighting. Some were calling out for people who had been dead for decades. Others were just staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The air was cold in here, too cold for the elderly. I walked down the long corridor, scanning every face, every open doorway. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then I saw her. At the very end of the hall, sitting in a rusted wheelchair near a broken vending machine. My beautiful Gloria. She was wearing a thin paper hospital gown that offered zero protection against the freezing draft coming from a poorly sealed window. She was clutching her arms across her chest, shivering violently. Her head was bowed, and I could hear the faint sound of her sobbing. The sound shattered whatever was left of my heart. I dropped to my knees right there on the filthy floor, pulling her into my arms. "Gloria," I whispered, holding her tight. "I got you, baby. I am right here." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Warren," she cried, her voice weak and trembling. "Why did they leave me here? It is so cold, Warren. I cannot breathe right." I pulled off my heavy flannel coat and wrapped it tightly around her frail shoulders. 6 months ago, my wife was the strongest woman I knew. She ran our household with an iron will and a heart full of grace. Then the stroke hit out of nowhere. It stole the strength from the left side of her body and left her depending on a machine to help her lungs work through the night. When the doctor told us the road to recovery would be long and brutal, I did not blink. I promised her right there in the hospital room that I would be her hands and her feet. And I kept that promise. For 6 months I bathed her, I fed her, I lifted her out of bed and into her chair. I woke up at 2 in the morning to check her oxygen levels, and I spent every afternoon massaging her paralyzed arm to keep the blood flowing. I did it because that is what a husband does. That is what a real man does when the woman he loves needs him. And where was Terrence during those grueling 6 months? Our only son was always too busy. He would come over once a month, stand in the doorway of her bedroom and say he had a big presentation at work. Or he would say Megan needed him at home to pick out tile for their bathroom remodel. He never once offered to lift her. He never once offered to pay for a private nurse. He just watched me exhaust myself, pretending he was too important to do the heavy lifting. I never asked him for a dime or a minute of his time because I knew he was weak. But I never imagined his weakness would allow his wife to treat his mother like garbage. I hooked up the fresh oxygen tank to her nasal cannula and turned the valve. Gloria took a deep breath, the panic in her chest slowly easing. I kissed her forehead. "We are going home," I told her. "I am taking you out of this place right now." I grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and turned to head back down the corridor. But before I could take 3 steps, a woman in a sharp gray pantsuit blocked my path. She held a manila folder in her hands and wore a look of professional condescension. She was flanked by the security guard from the lobby and another larger man in scrubs. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone entirely too calm for the situation. "I am the night director here. You need to step away from the patient. You are not authorized to remove her from the premises." I felt the anger rising from my stomach, a hot, dangerous fire. "This is my wife," I said, my voice low and steady. "She does not belong here. She needs her medication and a warm bed. Move out of my way." The director did not flinch. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of papers stamped with a blue legal seal. "I am afraid you have no legal authority over her care, Mr. Vance," she said, holding the papers up. "We received a direct transfer order from her legal guardian along with an emergency medical power of attorney." I stared at the papers. "That is impossible," I said. "I am her husband. I make her medical decisions." "Not anymore," the director replied coldly. "According to the sworn affidavit filed yesterday afternoon by your son Terrence Vance, you have been evaluated and deemed mentally unfit. It states you are suffering from severe cognitive decline and are a danger to her health. Terrence has been granted full medical guardianship, and his wife Megan authorized this transfer." The words hit me like a physical blow. A sworn affidavit, mentally unfit. Megan had not just thrown Gloria out. She had legally erased me. She had orchestrated a silent coup using my coward signature to strip me of my rights. She told the state I was losing my mind so they could take control of everything, including my wife. "This is a forgery," I growled, stepping toward the director. My son is a liar and his wife is a thief. I am taking my wife home. I pushed the wheelchair forward, but the large man in scrubs immediately grabbed the front wheels, stopping it dead. At the exact same moment, the heavy-set security guard stepped up and clamped a massive hand onto my shoulder. His grip was tight, digging into my collarbone. "Sir," the guard warned, his voice deep and threatening, "do not make me put you on the ground. You need to leave the facility right now, or I am calling the police." Every instinct I had learned in the military, every ounce of pride I carried as a man screamed at me to drop the guard. I could feel the adrenaline flooding my veins, urging me to smash his jaw, grab my wife, and fight my way out of the building. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails dug into my palms. But then I looked down at Gloria. She was weeping, clinging to the arms of the wheelchair, terrified by the shouting. If I threw a punch, I would be arrested for assaulting a security guard in a state facility. An angry black man in his 70s fighting in a hospital would end up in a holding cell before midnight. I would be locked away and Gloria would be trapped here under Megan's absolute control. Megan's plan relied on me losing my temper. She wanted me in jail. She wanted me out of the way. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the red mist of anger to recede. I relaxed my fists and stood up straight. I looked the security guard dead in the eye until he slowly removed his hand from my shoulder. I leaned down and kissed Gloria's wet cheek. "I will be back for you," I whispered so only she could hear. "I swear on my life, Gloria, I will be back." I turned around and walked down the cold hallway, leaving my heart sitting in that rusted wheelchair. I pushed through the heavy lobby doors and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago rain. I climbed into my truck and stared at the dark facility. I could not fight them with my fists. If I wanted to save my wife and destroy the people who did this to her, I had to play a completely different game. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed a number I had not called in 10 years. I looked at the heavy hand of the security guard on my shoulder. I looked at the smug face of the night director holding that forged piece of paper. The fire in my chest wanted to burn this entire building down to the foundation. But a man does not survive the steel mills and the jungles of Vietnam by letting his anger control his actions. A real man knows when to throw a punch and when to take a step back and let his enemy think they have won. Megan wanted me to lose my temper. She wanted me to swing at this guard so the police would drag me away in handcuffs. If I was sitting in a jail cell, I could not protect my wife. I slowly lowered my hands and took a deep breath of the foul air. I looked the director right in her eyes and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "You win for tonight," I said, my voice low and steady. "I will not cause a scene." I took one last look at my beautiful Gloria, sitting in that rusted wheelchair. I promised her silently that this nightmare would end soon. I turned my back on them and walked down the cold hallway. Every step felt like walking through thick mud, but I forced myself to keep moving. I pushed through the double doors of the facility and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago rain. The cold water hit my face, but it felt good. It cleared my head. I climbed into the cab of my old Ford truck and locked the doors. The heater barely worked, but I did not care. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I needed a weapon that was much stronger than my fists. I needed the law. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years: Arthur Jenkins. 40 years ago, Arthur and I were shop stewards together at the mill. We fought tooth and nail against the corporate bosses to get fair wages and safe working conditions for our brothers. Arthur always had a brilliant mind for the rules. He left the mill, went to law school at night, and eventually climbed his way up to become a probate judge in Cook County. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Warren," he said, sounding surprised but warm. "It has been too long, old friend. What has you calling me at this hour?" "Arthur, I need your help," I said, my voice tight with suppressed rage. "My daughter-in-law just forged a medical power of attorney and dumped my wife in a state-run facility. They declared me mentally unfit to get me out of the way. I need an emergency injunction to pull her out right now." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice had lost all its warmth and replaced it with cold, professional authority. "A forged medical power of attorney is a serious felony, Warren," he said. "Are you absolutely certain Terrence and his wife faked your signature?" "I would bet my life on it, Arthur," I replied. "I have been taking care of Gloria every single day since her stroke. I never signed away my rights, and I never gave them permission to put her in Oak Creek care." "Oak Creek." Arthur muttered a curse under his breath. "That place is a death trap. Listen to me very carefully, Warren. I cannot officially rule on a case involving a personal friend, but I know the duty judge working the emergency docket tonight. Drive to the downtown courthouse right now. I will make a phone call and have a clerk waiting for you with the paperwork. We are going to file an emergency ex parte motion to suspend that forged document immediately. You will have to swear under oath that the signature is a forgery. I will swear to God and the whole world, I said, starting the truck. Thank you, Arthur. Get moving, Warren, he said. Let us get Gloria out of that place. I put the truck in gear and sped out of the parking lot toward downtown Chicago. The rain was letting up, but my determination was growing stronger. It took me exactly 3 hours to secure the legal ammunition I needed. The emergency duty judge reviewed my sworn statement, and Arthur had clearly spoken to him beforehand because the process moved with impossible speed. By 2 a.m, I was walking back through the front doors of Oak Creek Care holding a court order stamped with a bright blue seal. The same night director was sitting at the front desk drinking a cup of cheap coffee. She looked up and frowned when she saw me approaching. "Mr. Vance," she said, sounding annoyed. "I told you if you returned, I would have to call the police." "Call them," I said, slamming the court order down on the plexiglass counter. "Call the police and tell them you are holding my wife against my will after a Cook County judge just overturned your fraudulent power of attorney." The director picked up the paper and read it. Her face drained of color as her eyes scanned the judge's signature and the bold letters commanding the immediate release of Gloria Vance. "This is an emergency injunction," she whispered. "That is right," I replied, my voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "It legally invalidates whatever garbage my son gave you. Now bring me my wife before I sue this facility for unlawful detainment." The director did not say another word. She picked up her radio and called the orderlies. 10 minutes later, they wheeled Gloria out into the lobby. She looked exhausted, her head resting against the side of the chair, but when she saw me, a faint smile crossed her lips. I rushed forward and wrapped her in my coat again. "I am taking you out of here, baby," I whispered. I wheeled her out into the cold night and carefully lifted her into the passenger seat of my truck. I hooked up her oxygen and buckled her seatbelt. We were not going back to our house, not while Megan and Terrence were still there. Instead, I drove us to a secure high-end hotel suite downtown. I paid for a week in advance using a credit card Megan did not know about. I carried Gloria up to the room, laid her down on a massive soft mattress, and covered her with thick, warm blankets. I gave her the blood pressure medication she desperately needed and sat beside her holding her good hand until her breathing steadied and she finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. She was safe for now. My wife was finally safe from the immediate danger they had put her in. That was all that mattered in this exact moment. I walked over to the large window overlooking the quiet city streets and let out a long breath. But the fight was far from over. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sat down in the armchair by the window. We had installed a smart home security system last year to help monitor the house in case Gloria ever fell while I was in the yard. Megan and Terrence had completely forgotten about the cameras hidden in the living room and the main hallway. I opened the application on my phone and tapped on the live feed for our master bedroom. The room was brightly lit. Megan was standing in the center of the room with her arms crossed, looking incredibly pleased with herself. Terrence was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in the guest room, drowning his guilt in a glass of cheap whiskey. But Megan was not alone. Standing next to her was a man in a sharp, tailored suit holding a laser measuring tape and a digital tablet. I watched the screen closely as the man pointed the red laser beam across the width of the room and typed the numbers into his tablet. He walked over to the ensuite bathroom and inspected the fixtures. I recognized the company logo embroidered on his jacket pocket. He was not a contractor looking to renovate. He was a high-end real estate appraiser. A cold realization washed over me, gripping my chest like a vice. They were not just kicking us out to move into the master bedroom. They were appraising the property to sell it. They were trying to liquidate my home and take everything we owned. The war had officially begun, and I was ready to fight until my very last breath to completely destroy every single thing they valued in this world. I woke up the next morning in the hotel suite. Gloria was still sleeping peacefully, breathing easily with her fresh oxygen tank humming quietly beside her. I made sure she had water and her emergency call button right next to her hand. I kissed her forehead and told her I had some errands to run. I needed to return to the house alone. I needed them to believe they had completely broken me. I drove my Ford truck back to the neighborhood I had lived in for 40 years. I parked on the street, not wanting to block the contractor vans taking up space in my driveway. I walked slowly, dragging my feet just a little bit more than usual. I let my shoulders slump. I needed to look like a man who had lost everything. I pushed open the front door. The house smelled like fresh paint and strong coffee. Megan was standing in the kitchen leaning against the marble countertop I had installed for Gloria 10 years ago. She was wearing a crisp white blouse, looking like she owned the world. When she saw me walk in, she did not look surprised. She looked triumphant. "You are back early, Warren," she said, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "I assume you brought boxes. You have a lot of junk in the basement to clear out." I kept my head down, "I just came to get the rest of my clothes," I muttered, my voice intentionally raspy and weak. "I will be out of your way in an hour." Megan smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "That is the smartest thing you have said all week," she replied. "Go pack your bags. We have another contractor coming at noon, and I do not want you getting in the way." I walked past her, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Every step I took toward my bedroom was a deliberate act of submission. I went to the closet and started pulling my old flannel shirts off the hangers. I tossed them into a faded canvas duffel bag. I listened to the sounds of my house being dismantled around me. I could hear the contractors tearing up the baseboards in the guest room. I could hear Megan laughing loudly on the phone, talking about an expensive vacation to Italy. She was already spending money she did not have. She thought she had won. She thought stripping an old man of his dignity was a simple transaction. I finished packing my duffel bag and zipped it shut. I took one last look around the room where I had slept next to my wife for decades. I picked up the bag and walked slowly back out into the kitchen. I needed to see what their next move was. I needed to know exactly how far their greed was pushing them. Megan was off the phone, sitting at the kitchen island. Terrence was sitting next to her, eating a bowl of cereal like a giant overgrown child. He looked up when I walked in, but immediately dropped his gaze back to his bowl. He could not look his father in the eyes. I placed my duffel bag on the floor by the front door. "I will come back for the tools in the garage this weekend," I said quietly. Megan set her coffee mug down and let out a sharp sigh. "Actually, Warren, we need to talk about the garage," she said, her tone shifting to fake sympathy. "We are having the garage completely cleared out tomorrow. A professional cleaning crew is coming. You see, we had the house officially appraised yesterday afternoon." Terrence finally stopped chewing, but he still did not look up. Megan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the granite counter. "The appraiser said with the new subway line expansion being planned down the street and the renovations we are doing, this property will easily list for $1.5 million. She said, the number slowly letting the sheer size of it hang in the air. $1.5 million. My blood boiled, but I kept my face completely blank. "That is a lot of money," I said softly, playing the part of the ignorant old fool. "It is a life-changing amount of money," she agreed, her eyes gleaming with greed. "Terrence and I are going to use it to start his consulting firm and buy a proper estate in the suburbs. But we are not completely heartless, Warren. We know you and Gloria are going to have expenses at whatever state facility you end up in." Terrence nodded silently, staring at his spoon. He was a pathetic excuse for a man validating her disrespect with his silence. Megan reached into a leather folder on the counter and pulled out a stack of papers. "If you sign these final transfer papers quietly today without making any more trouble, I am willing to offer you a monthly stipend," she said. "I will personally send you $500 every month to help cover your basic needs." $500 for a house worth $1.5 million. It was not just a horrific insult, it was a joke. She was trying to buy my silence with the spare change she would probably spend on a single pair of shoes. She wanted me to sign away my entire life for a fraction of a penny. I looked at Terrence. "Is this what you want, son?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to sound broken. "Are you really going to let her give me $500 a month for the house I built with my own hands?" Terrence swallowed hard. "Dad, it is a fair deal," he mumbled, barely opening his mouth. "We are taking on all the risk with the renovations. You do not need the money where you are going. You and Mom will be taken care of by the state. You should just sign the papers and move on." He actually believed it. He actually believed he was doing me a favor. I took a shuffling step toward the kitchen island. "I need to see what I am signing," I said, reaching a trembling hand toward the papers. Megan smiled, pleased with how easily I surrendered. She slid the documents across the smooth counter. "Just sign at the bottom of the last page," she instructed, tapping her fingernail on the paper. I looked down at the document. My mind is sharp. I recognized the legal formatting immediately. It was a quitclaim deed used to quickly transfer the title of real estate. Megan listed Terrence as the grantor, acting under the forged medical power of attorney. Under the section for the grantee, she already filled in the name of a corporate entity, Apex Horizon Development, LLC. She had already found a shady cash buyer willing to push the sale through quickly. I leaned over the paper, acting like I was having trouble reading. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my glasses, but I also palmed my cell phone, sliding it out under the cover of my flannel sleeve. I brought my hand up, faking a cough. With one swift motion, I angled the camera lens at the document and pressed the volume button. The phone clicked silently, capturing an image of the buyer's LLC name and corporate address. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Megan snatched the papers away, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" she snapped, pulling the documents against her chest. "I said you just need to sign the last page." I let my shoulders slump further. "I am sorry," I murmured, my voice weak. "I just wanted to make sure my name was spelled right. I cannot sign it right now anyway. My hands are shaking too much. I will come back tomorrow and sign it." Megan rolled her eyes. "Fine," she huffed. "Tomorrow, Warren. No more delays. If you do not sign it by tomorrow afternoon, the $500 offer is off the table. Do you understand me?" I nodded my head. "I understand completely," I whispered. I turned around, picked up my duffel bag, and walked out the front door. The moment the door shut behind me, my posture completely changed. My shoulders straightened. The weakness vanished from my legs. I walked down the driveway with heavy, determined steps. I pulled my phone out and looked at the clear photo of the quitclaim deed. Apex Horizon Development, LLC. Now I knew exactly who the buyer was. I knew where the money was coming from. Megan thought she outsmarted a senile old fool. She had no idea she just handed me the final piece of the puzzle I needed. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to set the federal trap and watch them walk right into their own prison cell. I unlocked my truck and finally started the heavy engine right away. I started my truck and pulled away from the house, leaving Megan and Terrence to their delusions of grandeur. The photograph of the real estate document on my phone was a loaded weapon, but I needed to know exactly how much my daughter-in-law had already stolen from us. I drove straight to the First National Bank on Elm Street. Gloria and I opened our joint savings account at this exact branch 40 years ago. We knew the tellers by their first names. It was the account where we deposited a little piece of my paycheck every single week. That money was not for a luxury vacation or a fancy new car. It was our survival fund. After Gloria's stroke, it became her lifeline. It held $60,000 specifically earmarked for her physical therapy, her in-home nursing care, and the medical equipment she needed to regain her mobility. I parked the truck and walked into the quiet, air-conditioned lobby. The familiar smell of polished wood and fresh coffee usually brought me a sense of security, but today my stomach was tied in knots. I walked up to the counter and smiled at Sarah, a teller who had been working there for 15 years. "Good morning, Warren," she said, returning the smile, but her eyes looked a little sad. "How is Gloria doing today?" "She is holding her own." "Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I just need to check the balance on our joint savings account. I want to make sure the funds for her next round of physical therapy are ready to go." Sarah nodded and typed my account number into her computer. I watched her face as the screen loaded. Her warm smile faded, instantly replaced by a look of deep confusion and then genuine concern. She hit a few more keys, her brow furrowing. "Warren," she said softly, looking around the lobby before leaning closer to the glass. "Your savings account is completely empty. The balance is zero." The words hit me hard, even though I had suspected the worst. Zero. $60,000 wiped out. "How is that possible?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah swallowed hard. "Your son Terrence came in yesterday afternoon right before closing," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He brought his wife, Megan, and a medical power of attorney document. They told the branch manager that you were incapacitated and that they needed to consolidate your assets to pay for a long-term care facility for Gloria. They withdrew the entire $60,000 in the form of a cashier's check made out to Megan. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They used the same forged document they used to lock my wife in that state-run hellhole to steal every penny we had saved for her recovery. They did not just want the house, they wanted to strip us down to the bone." Sarah saw the look on my face and immediately stood up. "Let me get Mr. Peterson," she said, referring to the branch manager. "He needs to speak with you right now." She hurried away from the window and returned a minute later with David Peterson, a man I had known for over a decade. He ushered me into his private glass-walled office and closed the door tightly behind us. "Warren, I am so sorry, he began, looking genuinely distressed as he sat behind his heavy oak desk. Terrence presented a court-stamped medical power of attorney. It looked completely legitimate, and as your son, he had the legal standing to act on it. I had no idea you were capable of managing your own affairs. They told me you were suffering from severe dementia. I took a slow, deep breath. David, I said, keeping my emotions completely locked down. That document was a forgery. They faked my signature and lied to the state. I am not suffering from dementia, and my wife is currently recovering in a secure hotel room because they tried to dump her in a state facility to steal my house. David's face turned pale. He stared at me for a long moment as the reality of the situation washed over him. A forgery, he repeated, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Warren, that is massive bank fraud. They stole $60,000 from a federally insured institution. We have them on security cameras. We have copies of the forged documents they submitted. He reached across his desk and grabbed the sleek black telephone receiver. I am calling the police right now, he stated firmly. I am going to have detectives at their house before lunch. They belong in handcuffs. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his hand, stopping him from dialing the number. No, David, I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. Do not call the local police. David looked at me like I had lost my mind. Warren, they robbed you, he argued. They stole your wife's medical fund. We have the evidence to stop them today. I know they did, I replied, pulling my hand back and sitting straight up in my chair. But if you call the local police right now, they will get arrested for simple theft and forgery. Megan will hire a slick defense lawyer. She will cry in front of a judge and claim she was just overwhelmed and made a mistake trying to help. She might serve a few months in a county jail or maybe just get probation. That is not enough for what she did to my wife. David slowly placed the phone back on its cradle. What are you asking me to do, Warren? He asked, his eyes wide with apprehension. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on his desk. I need you to put a silent fraud alert on the account and on that cashier's check I instructed. Flag it in the banking system so every transaction she makes with that money is tracked and logged by the Federal Financial Network, but do not freeze the funds. Let her spend it. Let her think she got away with it. David shook his head slowly. I do not understand, he admitted. Why would you let her spend the money you need for glorious care? Because I am giving her enough rope to hang herself, I explained calmly. Megan is currently trying to sell my house using the same forged documents. She is working with a corporate cash buyer. If she signs those real estate papers and receives a wire transfer of $1.5 million across state lines, she elevates this from a local dispute to federal wire fraud. If she uses stolen bank funds to facilitate that sale or buys luxury goods, she is adding money laundering and federal bank fraud to her list of crimes. I am not looking for a slap on the wrist, David. I want her buried under so many federal charges that she never sees the outside of a prison cell again. David sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. You are playing a very dangerous game, Warren, he said quietly. If she spends that $60,000, you might never get it back. I am willing to take that risk, I told him. Put the silent alert on the file. Track every dime she spends, and when the time comes, I will need you to hand those logs directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Will you do this for me? David looked at the family photo on my desk and then back at me. He nodded slowly. I will set up the silent alert right now, he agreed. But Warren, you better know exactly what you are doing. I stood up from the chair and offered him my hand. I know exactly what I am doing, David, I assured him. Thank you. I walked out of the bank feeling a strange sense of calm settling over me. The trap was set and the financial tripwires were armed. I drove back toward my neighborhood and parked my truck 2 blocks away from my house, just out of sight. I walked the rest of the way, staying in the shadows of the large oak trees that lined the street. As I approached my property, I saw exactly what $60,000 of stolen money buys a person with no moral compass. Pulling into my driveway was a brand new jet black luxury vehicle. The driver's side door opened and Megan stepped out wearing sunglasses. She looked like a woman who had just conquered the world. She saw me standing on the sidewalk and let out a bright, arrogant laugh. She reached into her purse, pulled out shiny keys, and tossed them. Wash the tires, she smirked, walking away. She had absolutely no idea the federal radar was silently pinging her stolen vehicle right now. I left the shadows of my quiet street and walked back to my truck, leaving Megan to admire her stolen luxury vehicle. My blood was running hot, but my mind was completely locked onto the mission ahead. I drove my truck straight downtown to the financial district, navigating the heavy Chicago traffic with practiced ease. I pulled into a parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper and rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor. The brass letters on the double doors read Harrison and Associates. Marcus Harrison was not just a brilliant real estate attorney. He was a former Marine who served 2 tours in the Middle East. He understood loyalty, and he understood exactly how to destroy an enemy using the full weight of the law. I walked into his spacious office and dropped my canvas duffel bag on the floor. Marcus stood up from his heavy mahogany desk, extending a firm hand. "Warren, it is good to see you," he said, his sharp eyes scanning my face. "But you look like a man preparing for a major offensive." I took the leather chair across from him and pulled out my cell phone. "I am going to war, Marcus," I told him, sliding the phone across the polished wood surface. "I need you to look at the photograph on the screen." Marcus picked up the phone and adjusted his silver glasses. He studied the image of the quitclaim deed I had covertly taken in my kitchen. The room was dead silent for a full minute while his trained legal mind processed the document. He set the phone down and let out a low whistle. "Apex Horizon Development, LLC," he read aloud, leaning back in his chair. "This is a fast cash corporate buyer. They swoop in and buy properties under market value to flip them for massive profits. And according to this document, your son Terrence is listed as the grantor signing the property over to them." Marcus looked me dead in the eye. "Warren, they are trying to liquidate your house." "I know," I replied, my voice completely steady. "Megan forged a medical power of attorney yesterday. She used it to throw Gloria into a state-run facility and declare me mentally unfit. This morning, she showed me this deed and tried to bribe me with a $500 monthly allowance to sign it quietly." Marcus clenched his jaw, his military discipline barely containing his sudden anger. "That is absolute garbage," he growled. "We can go to a judge right now and file an injunction to freeze the property. We can have Terrence and Megan arrested for forging the medical documents and attempting real estate fraud. We have enough evidence to stop this sale dead in its tracks today." I shook my head slowly, resting my hands on the arms of the leather chair. "No, Marcus," I said firmly. "I do not want to stop the sale today. I want you to let them proceed. I want them to sit at the closing table and sign that document." Marcus looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Warren, if they sign that document and the title company accepts it, the house is legally transferred to Apex Horizon. They will walk away with $1.5 million, and you will be out on the street." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Do you remember what we did 5 years ago, Marcus?" I asked him directly. "Do you remember the paperwork we filed when Gloria and I decided we wanted to give something back to the men and women who came home from the service with permanent injuries?" The confusion on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a look of sheer realization. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy file folder with my name printed on the tab. He flipped through the crisp pages until he found a document bearing a massive red federal seal. 5 years ago, I said, letting the truth finally breathe in the open air, Gloria and I decided we did not need the massive equity sitting in that house. So we sat in this exact office and we legally donated the absolute deed of the property to the Disabled Veterans Housing Trust. We took a massive tax write-off, and in exchange we only kept a life estate. That means we have the legal right to live in the house until the day we die, but we do not own the dirt or the bricks anymore. The concept of a life estate is incredibly powerful if you know how to use it. I continued, leaning back in my chair and watching his eyes wide with shock. We gave the massive financial value of the property to the trust 5 years ago. They hold the absolute deed and the legal title to the land. In return, the charity granted us the irrevocable right to reside in the dwelling for the remainder of our natural lives. No one can ever evict us. No one can ever force us to sell. But more importantly, no one else has the legal right to sell the property because it is completely owned by the federal charity. It was the smartest financial decision Gloria and I ever made. We protected our home from property taxes, and we ensured that when we pass away, the proceeds from the eventual sale will go directly toward building accessible housing for veterans who lost limbs in combat zones. It was our legacy. We never told Terrence because we knew his greedy nature. We knew he would throw a fit if he found out his inheritance was gone. And now that very same secret is going to be the exact weapon that seals his absolute destruction. Marcus stared at the federal seal on the document. The Disabled Veterans Housing Trust is a registered 501c3 charity, he he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It is a federally protected organization. That means the house on Elm Street does not belong to you, Warren. It has not belonged to you for half a decade. I nodded my head, feeling a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. Exactly, I said. The property is an asset of a federal charity dedicated to housing wounded veterans. Terrence and Megan think they are stealing my inheritance. They think they are pushing a helpless old man out into the cold to make a quick $1.5 million. But they are completely blind to the reality of the battlefield they just walked onto. Marcus looked down at the forged quitclaim deed on my phone and then back at the trust documents. If Megan uses a forged power of attorney to sign this deed, she is not committing local fraud against her father-in-law. He explained the legal reality forming a perfect trap. She is actively attempting to steal a $1.5 million asset directly from the federal government. She is defrauding a registered charity. I watched the realization fully take hold of my attorney. That is right, I told him. When she signs that paper, she is committing massive federal crimes. Local police will not handle this. A county judge will not handle this. She is going to trigger a full investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There will be no suspended sentences or easy plea deals for stealing from crippled war veterans. The federal prosecutors will bury her under the jail. They will freeze every single asset she has ever touched. They will seize the new luxury vehicle she just bought with my wife's stolen medical funds. They will completely dismantle her entire life brick by brick until she has absolutely nothing left but a prison uniform and a massive federal restitution bill she can never repay. Marcus closed the file folder and folded his hands on the desk. You are weaponizing the federal government against your own family, he said quietly. I am defending my wife, I corrected him, my tone dropping to a dangerous level. My son chose his greedy wife over the mother who gave him life. He let her throw my wife's oxygen tank into a garbage bag in the freezing rain. They crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. I am simply stepping out of the way and letting their own blind greed destroy them. Marcus nodded, his expression turning completely professional and utterly ruthless. The buyer, Apex Horizon, operates quickly, he noted, checking the date on his calendar. If they appraised the house yesterday, they will likely push for a 48-hour closing. They will want to finalize the wire transfer and take possession by Friday morning. We need to contact the federal authorities right now to set up the sting. I shook my head. Not yet, I instructed. We cannot spook her. If the federal agents move in too early, Megan might get scared and back out of the deal. She needs to feel completely safe. She needs to feel like she has already won. I need her to sit down in that expensive title office, pick up a pen, and willingly sign her own name on the dotted line. Only then is the crime fully executed. Only then is there absolutely no escape. Marcus picked up his phone. I have contacts in the Cyber and Financial Crimes Division of the Bureau, he said. I will brief them on the situation quietly. They will monitor the transaction from the shadows. But Warren, you have to play your part perfectly. You have to go back to that house and act like a beaten dog. You cannot let her suspect a single thing until the ink is completely dry. I stood up from the leather chair and picked up my duffel bag. Do not worry about my performance, Marcus, I said, walking toward the door. I have spent my entire life doing the heavy lifting while people underestimated me. I can survive 3 more days in that house. I will swallow every insult she throws at me. I will let her humiliate me in front of the world. Because on Friday morning, I am going to watch the federal government take everything she loves away from her forever. They will never ever see it coming until it is too late. I drove back to my house on Saturday morning feeling a cold determination settling deep into my bones. The weekend air was crisp, but my blood ran hot with absolute purpose. When I pulled up to the curb, I saw luxury cars lining both sides of the street. Megan had wasted absolutely no time. She had hired a staging company to completely erase 40 years of my family history overnight. The front lawn was freshly manicured and shiny open house signs were planted firmly in the grass. I walked up the driveway, keeping my head down and my shoulders slumped. I pushed open the front door and stepped into a house that I barely recognized. The walls were painted a sterile white, and modern furniture replaced the comfortable pieces Gloria and I had carefully chosen over the decades. The living room was filled with wealthy potential buyers holding expensive coffee cups and wearing designer coats. Megan stood in the center of the room wearing a tailored navy blue dress. She looked like a wealthy socialite hosting a massive charity gala. When she saw me walk through the door, her fake smile immediately vanished, and her blue eyes turned incredibly cold. She marched over to me holding a plastic bag. She shoved it into my chest and ordered me to go to the laundry room and change immediately. I walked to the small room in the back of the house and opened the bag. Inside was a cheap blue uniform shirt with the word maintenance stitched over the front pocket. She was not just trying to force me out of my home. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. She wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would never dare to fight her back again. I took off my heavy flannel coat and slowly unbuttoned my shirt. I slipped the cheap blue fabric over my shoulders and buttoned it up. It was tight across my chest and the rough material scratched my skin. I looked at myself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. I saw an old man wearing the uniform of a servant in the house he had built with his own 2 hands. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, thinking about Gloria sleeping safely in her secure hotel room while I prepared for this brutal and absolute war. I reminded myself that every single insult I swallowed today was another solid iron bar in Megan's federal prison cell. I walked back out into the bright living room, keeping my posture hunched and my steps slow. Megan was speaking to a couple wearing expensive watches and tailored suits. She pointed her finger at me and told them I was the hired help brought in to keep the floors clean during the open house. The wealthy couple barely glanced in my direction before turning their attention back to admire the newly installed light fixtures hanging from the very high ceiling. Megan handed me a damp, dirty rag and a heavy plastic spray bottle filled with harsh chemical cleaner. She pointed to a set of muddy footprints near the front entrance and told me to get on my hands and knees and scrub the hardwood floor. I did not argue with her. I did not show a single ounce of anger or defiance. I simply nodded my head, dropped down to my knees, and began to wipe the cold floor. The strong chemical smell stung my eyes, but I kept scrubbing the wood until it was completely spotless and clean again. I listened carefully to the conversations happening all around me. I took very careful mental notes of the people walking through my home. I watched how Megan blatantly lied to them about the neighborhood and the history of the property. She told them her father had built the house and left it to her husband. She erased my existence with a casual flip of her hair and a bright fake smile. I scrubbed the exact same spot on the floor until my knuckles ached. I let the terrible humiliation wash completely over me, letting it fuel my dark inner fire. I knew that the lower I bowed today, the harder she would fall on Friday morning. As I moved slowly across the floor, cleaning up the dirt left behind by the rich strangers, I finally saw Terrence. My son was standing in the far corner of the dining room, leaning heavily against the wall. He was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and holding a heavy crystal glass filled with dark amber scotch. It was barely noon and he was already drinking heavily. He looked absolutely terrible. His skin was incredibly pale and dark circles hung very heavy under his eyes. He looked physically sick with immense guilt. He watched me crawling on the floor wearing a cheap maintenance shirt, wiping up mud for his wife. For one brief agonizing second, our eyes finally met. I saw the deep shame radiating from his face. I saw the little boy I had raised, the boy who used to look up to me with absolute admiration. But that boy was entirely gone. Terrence looked away, unable to hold my gaze for more than a single heartbeat. He lifted the heavy glass to his lips and took a long, desperate swallow of strong scotch. He was trying to numb the terrible reality of what he was doing to his own family. He actively chose to look away while his arrogant wife paraded his father around like a stray dog. I felt a profound sense of absolute pity for him. He had traded his soul and his dignity for a piece of property he did not even legally own. I finished cleaning the entryway and stood up holding the dirty rag. The open house was a chaotic, loud blur of extreme greed and pure arrogance. But then, the entire room suddenly shifted. A very tall, serious man wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a sleek black leather briefcase walked boldly through the front door. He did not bother looking at the staged, modern furniture or the fresh white paint. He walked with the cold, calculated purpose of a ruthless corporate predator. He bypassed all the other wealthy potential buyers and walked directly up to Megan. I moved silently closer, pretending to wipe down the edge of the kitchen counter so I could clearly hear every single word they said. The man introduced himself as a senior acquisition agent for Apex Horizon. He told Megan his massive firm had completely reviewed the real estate appraisal from the previous day, and they were fully prepared to make an incredibly aggressive move. He slowly opened his black briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. He handed the important document directly to Megan and stated his offer plainly for everyone around to hear. $1.5 million in cold hard cash. He said there would be no contingencies and absolutely no financing delays. He said his firm wanted to close the massive deal quickly and quietly by very early Friday morning. He explained they wanted to begin their own massive, expensive renovations before the local city finalized the new subway expansion plans down the street. I watched Megan's eyes widen dramatically as she quickly read the written offer. The sheer amount of money completely blinded her to everything else in the entire world. She looked at the corporate agent and smiled, her face flushed with pure, unadulterated, extreme greed. She told him the high price was acceptable, but she had her own strict conditions. She wanted absolute certainty that the firm would not suddenly back out at the very last minute. She demanded a massive non-refundable deposit of $150,000 to be transferred immediately today. The agent did not even blink at her arrogant demand. He agreed to her strict terms without a single moment of hesitation. He told her the title company would draft the final closing documents by Thursday afternoon, and he desperately needed the specific deposit instructions by the end of the day. Megan eagerly agreed, promising to send him the routing numbers for her personal bank account immediately. She shook his hand, sealing the terrible deal that would completely destroy her entire life. I gripped the dirty rag in my hand so tightly my tired fingers turned completely white. A large wire transfer. She was going to demand a $150,000 wire transfer across state lines for a property that legally belonged to a federal charity. The exact moment that digital money hit her personal bank account, she would commit massive federal wire fraud. The federal trap was now fully armed, and she had just eagerly handed me the absolute detonator. I smiled quietly and went back to scrubbing the cold floor, waiting patiently for her ultimate absolute destruction. I kept my head down and continued to scrub the floor long after the open house ended. The wealthy buyers left the house one by one, leaving behind empty coffee cups and muddy footprints. Megan walked around the living room humming a cheerful tune, completely intoxicated by the prospect of becoming a millionaire. Terrence was passed out on the guest room bed, snoring loudly, having drank himself into a heavy stupor to escape his crushing guilt. Megan did not even bother to check on him. She walked into the kitchen and sat at the granite island, pulling out her expensive laptop and a small leather notebook. I stayed in the hallway, pretending to wipe down the baseboards, but my eyes were fixed on her every move. I watched her open a web browser and navigate to the website of a massive national bank. It was not the local bank where she and Terrence held their joint checking account. It was a completely different financial institution known for handling high-wealth clients and offshore transfers. She aggressively typed on the keyboard, entering her personal information and social security number. She was setting up a brand new account. I crept closer, moving silently across the hardwood floor until I was standing just a few feet behind her, hidden by the large stainless steel refrigerator. I leaned my head out just enough to see the glowing laptop screen. She was filling out the beneficiary forms and the ownership declarations. She checked the box indicating she was the sole owner of the account. There was no mention of Terrence. There was no secondary access granted to her husband. She was actively setting up a secret financial vault solely in her name to receive the massive $150,000 non-refundable deposit. Her greed was so absolute and all-consuming that she was completely cutting her own partner in crime out of the initial cash grab. She planned to secure the deposit for herself before the ink was even dry on the real estate documents. If Terrence ever found his meager spine and decided to back out of the fraudulent sale, she would already possess a small fortune that he could never touch. I watched her copy the newly generated routing number and account number onto a fresh sheet of paper from her leather notebook. She quickly drafted an email to the senior acquisition agent from Apex Horizon, attaching the secret banking details and demanding the wire transfer be initiated the moment the banks opened on Monday morning. She hit send and closed the laptop with a loud, satisfying snap. She smiled to herself, completely unaware that I was standing in the shadows, memorizing the exact name of the bank and the last 4 digits of the routing number she wrote down. She left the kitchen to pour herself another glass of expensive wine, leaving her notebook sitting completely unguarded on the island. I stepped out from behind the refrigerator and quickly memorized the remaining numbers. I walked back to the hallway, my heart pounding with a dark, triumphant rhythm. She was actively digging her own grave deeper than I could have ever imagined. She was not just defrauding a federal charity and an old man. She was executing a calculated financial betrayal against her own husband. Her supreme arrogance blinded her to the massive digital trail she was leaving behind. Every keystroke was a permanent record of her premeditated felony. I finished cleaning the baseboards and quietly slipped out the back door. I walked down the dark street to my truck, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs. I pulled my phone from my pocket and immediately dialed Marcus. The trap was growing larger and more complex by the hour. I needed to hand this new explosive information over to the authorities immediately to ensure her absolute destruction. I sat in my truck and turned the key, letting the engine roar to life. The heater blasted warm air against my hands, but my mind was entirely focused on the numbers I had just memorized. I pulled a small wrench from the glove compartment and used a permanent marker to write the exact bank account details on the metal handle. I placed the wrench carefully back into the glove box and shifted the truck into drive. Megan was building her own massive cage, and I was quietly gathering the heavy iron bars. To destroy her forever, I needed more help right now. I drove across the city to a massive, unmarked concrete building located deep in the downtown Federal District. Marcus was already waiting for me, standing under the bright security lights near the heavily guarded entrance. He wore a dark trench coat and held a thick leather briefcase containing all the legal documents we had compiled over the last 5 years. We walked silently through the metal detectors and showed our identification to the stern armed guards stationed in the lobby. Marcus had pulled several major strings to secure a late-night emergency meeting with a senior special agent from the Cyber and Financial Crimes Division. We rode the silent elevator up to the 14th floor and walked down a long, sterile corridor until we reached a secure conference room. A tall man with graying hair and a sharp, dark suit was waiting for us, sitting at the head of a large mahogany table. He introduced himself as Special Agent Miller. He did not offer us anything to drink or make small talk. He simply opened a fresh notepad and asked us to present our evidence. Marcus opened his briefcase and laid the heavily stamped federal trust documents directly onto the table. He explained in precise legal terms that the residential property in question was legally owned by the Disabled Veterans Housing Trust, a federally protected charity organization. I then pushed my cell phone across the table, showing Agent Miller the clear photograph of the forged quitclaim deed listing Terrence as the grantor and Apex Horizon as the buyer. I verbally provided the exact banking routing numbers Megan had just created to receive the massive fraudulent deposit. Agent Miller listened to every single word with absolute intense focus. His eyes darted between the forged documents and the legitimate charity deed. When we finished our detailed explanation, the room fell completely silent. The sheer magnitude of the crime was undeniable. This was not a simple family dispute over a stolen television or a forged personal check. This was a highly calculated conspiracy to defraud the United States government and steal massive resources from crippled soldiers. Agent Miller picked up the photograph of the forged deed and studied the terrible forged signature. He looked up at me, his expression completely unreadable and professional. "Your daughter-in-law is attempting to steal $1.5 million from a protected federal entity," he stated, his voice incredibly calm but carrying a heavy, dangerous weight. "If she completes this transaction using the interstate banking system, she will be committing multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and major charity fraud. The penalties for these combined offenses carry mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison with absolutely no possibility of early parole. She will lose everything she owns, and she will spend the best years of her life locked inside a concrete cell." I nodded slowly, feeling a deep sense of cold satisfaction wash over my tired bones. "That is exactly what I want," I told him, my voice steady and completely devoid of any mercy. "I want her arrested, and I want my son held fully accountable for standing by and letting her do this to my sick wife." Agent Miller leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "There is one major problem, Warren," he explained, his eyes locking onto mine. "We cannot arrest her right now. Intent to commit wire fraud is incredibly difficult to prosecute at this massive level. She has to physically receive that wire transfer across state lines, and she has to sign that fraudulent deed at the closing table. If we move in today, she will simply claim it was a misunderstanding and walk away with probation for local forgery. You have to keep the transaction completely alive without raising any suspicion." I understood the terrifying weight of his words instantly. I had to go back into that house and continue playing the broken victim while smiling into the face of the devil. I had to let her drag my family name through the mud for several more agonizing days. If I showed even a single ounce of defiance, she might panic and cancel the massive deal, ruining the entire trap. I promised him I would not fail. The pressure was crushing, but failure was simply impossible. I would play my part perfectly until the final devastating moment arrived. But first, I needed to give my son one last chance to save himself before everything was lost. Thursday night descended upon the house with a heavy, suffocating silence. The aggressive staging company had finally left, taking their noisy vans and bright lights with them. The neighborhood was completely still, but my mind was racing with the terrifying weight of the approaching morning. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the day the federal trap would spring shut and destroy everything. I walked through the empty hallways of the house I built. The walls felt cold and unfamiliar, stripped of all our family photographs and warm memories. Megan had already gone up to the master bedroom to sleep. She wanted to be perfectly rested for the massive payday she believed was waiting for her at the title office tomorrow. I walked toward the back of the house, heading for the garage. I needed to gather a few of my oldest hand tools before I left this property for the very last time. When I opened the heavy fireproof door connecting the mudroom to the garage, I saw a dim yellow light glowing in the corner. Terrence was standing alone near my old wooden workbench. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt from yesterday, holding a half-empty bottle of cheap beer. The garage smelled like motor oil sawdust and 40 years of hard, honest labor. This was the exact room where I taught him how to swing a hammer. This was the exact spot where we rebuilt his first bicycle together when he was 10 years old. I stood in the doorway watching my only son drown his massive guilt in cheap alcohol. I felt a sudden desperate urge to save him from the absolute destruction that was coming tomorrow. He was a weak man, and he had allowed his greedy wife to completely manipulate him, but he was still my flesh and blood. I walked slowly across the concrete floor. My heavy boots made a scuffing sound, but Terrence did not turn around immediately. He kept his head down, staring at an old rusty wrench resting on the wooden bench. I stopped just a few feet away from his slumping shoulders. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, damp air fill my tired lungs. "Terrence," I said, my voice low and completely calm in the quiet garage. He flinched slightly when he heard his name, but he still refused to look at me. "What do you want, Dad?" he mumbled, taking another slow drink from his brown glass bottle. "I am just packing up my remaining clothes for tomorrow. I came out here to get my old tools," I told him, stepping a little closer. "But I also came out here to give you one final opportunity to make things right. Tomorrow morning, you and your wife are going to sit down at a massive polished table and sign a legal document. You are going to take $1.5 million, and you are going to walk away from everything we ever built together. I want you to understand that once you sign your name on that paper, there is absolutely no turning back. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me you truly understand that actions have permanent consequences." Terrence gripped the neck of the beer bottle so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He let out a long, frustrated sigh and finally turned his body to face me. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was incredibly pale. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a massive, dark cliff, entirely terrified, but unable to stop himself from falling over the steep edge. "Dad, you are making this sound like some kind of terrible crime," he said, his voice shaking with defensive anger. "We are selling a house. That is all we are doing. We are liquidating a massive physical asset to secure our financial future. You and Mom do not need all this empty space anymore. You are getting older and your health is failing. It is time to let the younger generation take the heavy reins and make the hard decisions." I stared at him, feeling a cold, dark knot tightening deep inside my stomach. "You threw your dying mother into a state-run facility," I reminded him, my voice carrying a heavy, dangerous weight. "You let your wife toss her oxygen tank and her blood pressure medication out into the freezing rain like garbage. You signed a sworn legal affidavit falsely claiming I was suffering from severe dementia. Do you really believe those actions are just simple financial decisions?" Terrence took a step backward, bumping his hip against the heavy wooden workbench. "You need to stop living in the past, Dad," he argued, raising his voice slightly. "You are holding on to a reality that simply does not exist anymore. Megan knows exactly what is best for our financial future. She understands how the modern world works. We cannot just sit around and watch the massive equity in this house slowly rot away while you and Mom refuse to adapt. Megan has a brilliant vision for our future. She is going to start a massive consulting firm, and we are going to buy a beautiful new estate in the suburbs. This money is going to change our entire lives forever." I listened to his pathetic, desperate words. He was perfectly repeating the exact lies his wife had forced down his throat. He had surrendered his entire mind and his entire soul to her greedy ambition. I looked at the little boy I had raised and realized he was completely dead. The man standing in front of me was just an empty, hollow shell blindly following a ruthless, greedy woman into absolute destruction. "But your mother is lying in a hotel room relying on a machine to help her breathe," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any warm emotion. "You are actively choosing to steal her medical fund and sell her home so your wife can drive a luxury vehicle and buy designer clothes. You are choosing your greedy wife over your own flesh and blood." Terrence slammed his beer bottle down onto the wooden bench. The loud crash echoed loudly through the dark garage. "Yes, I am," he shouted, his face turning bright red with immense frustration and misplaced anger. "Megan is my wife. She is my future. You and Mom had your time and you made your choices. Now it is my turn to be successful. It is my turn to have the money and the respect I deserve. Megan is the only person who actually believes in my true potential. She is the only one pushing me to take what is rightfully mine. If you cannot accept that reality, then you just need to pack your cheap duffel bag and get out of our way. We are signing those final real estate papers tomorrow morning, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop us." The garage fell perfectly silent again. The heavy echo of his angry shouting faded into the cold, damp air. I stood completely still, looking at my only son for the very last time. Every single ounce of paternal warmth, every single drop of fatherly love I had ever felt for him completely died in that exact moment. The deep, powerful bond of shared blood completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard justice. I gave him the clear opportunity to confess. I gave him the chance to drop the forged documents, beg for forgiveness, and walk away from the federal trap. Instead, he actively embraced the terrible betrayal. He firmly planted his feet on the wrong side of the law, defending the very woman who was destroying his mother. I slowly nodded my head. My face was completely devoid of any sadness or regret. "I understand, Terrence," I said, my voice incredibly quiet but razor sharp. "You have made your final choice. You have chosen your path, and now you must walk it all the way to the very end. I will not stand in your way anymore." I turned my back on him and walked away from the old wooden workbench. I did not bother picking up my old rusty tools. I did not need them anymore. The only tools I needed now were the federal agents waiting in the shadows. I pushed open the heavy fireproof door and walked back into the silent, empty house. I grabbed my faded canvas duffel bag from the front hallway and walked out the front door, stepping into the cool, dark night. I climbed into my old Ford truck and started the heavy, rumbling engine. As I drove away from the property, I looked at the dark house in my rearview mirror one last time. Terrence thought he had finally won his independence and secured his massive fortune. He had no idea he had officially sealed his devastating fate as a willing accomplice to a federal crime. Friday morning arrived with a cold gray sky hanging heavy over the city of Chicago. The air was thick with the kind of tension that completely settles into your bones right before a massive storm breaks. I woke up in the quiet hotel suite and looked over at Gloria. She was resting comfortably, her breathing steady and peaceful. I kissed her warm forehead and told her I would be back soon with the absolute final victory. I dressed slowly, putting on my best dark suit. It was the same suit I wore to my retirement dinner from the steel mill many years ago. It commanded respect. I drove downtown toward the massive glass and steel skyscrapers that dominated the financial district. My destination was a high-end title and escrow office located on the 35th floor of a premium corporate tower. This was the exact location Megan had chosen to finalize her massive fraudulent payday. She wanted a place that looked expensive and secure to validate her extreme greed. I parked my truck in the underground garage and took the silent elevator up to the top floors. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into a sleek, modern reception area. The floors were polished white marble and the walls were lined with expensive, abstract art. I walked past the front desk, completely ignoring the young receptionist who tried to ask for my name. I knew exactly which conference room they were using. Agent Miller had given me the precise details the night before. I walked quietly down the long, carpeted hallway, my leather shoes making absolutely no sound. I stopped just outside the heavy glass door of Conference Room B. The walls were made of frosted glass, allowing me to see the blurred shapes of the people sitting inside without giving away my own presence. I stood there and watched them for a few long moments. Megan was sitting at the massive mahogany table wearing a brand new bright red designer dress. She looked incredibly arrogant and entirely pleased with herself. She had her expensive leather purse resting on the table next to a perfectly arranged stack of legal documents. Terrence was sitting right next to her wearing a dark gray suit that looked slightly wrinkled. He was sweating profusely and his hands were trembling as he held a small paper cup of water. He looked like a man walking toward an execution but completely lacking the courage to turn around and run away. Sitting directly across from them was the cash buyer. It was a man I had never seen before, but I knew exactly who he really was. He was an undercover federal agent working directly for the Cyber and Financial Crimes Division. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit, playing the role of a wealthy corporate acquisition manager flawlessly. He smiled warmly at Megan and nodded his head as she talked loudly about her grand plans for the future. The room was perfectly staged. The federal trap was completely set and ready to spring shut. The undercover agent opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of final closing documents. He placed them gently on the table and slid them across the polished wood toward Megan. He explained that these were the absolute final papers required to legally transfer the physical deed of the property and initiate the massive $150,000 wire transfer into her personal bank account. Megan leaned forward, her blue eyes completely wide with sheer, unadulterated greed. She did not bother reading the heavy legal text or examining the fine print. She was entirely blinded by the massive amount of money she believed was just seconds away from belonging to her. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out a shiny black Mont Blanc pen. She held it elegantly in her hand, preparing to sign her name and complete the devastating betrayal against my sick wife and me. Terrence looked down at the table, completely avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. He was actively allowing his wife to steal a federal asset while he sat there drowning in his own pathetic guilt. The tension inside the glass conference room was absolutely suffocating. The undercover agent sat back in his chair, maintaining a perfectly calm and professional demeanor while he watched the terrible crime unfold right in front of him. Every single detail was perfectly aligned for their complete and absolute destruction today. I reached out and grabbed the heavy metal handle of the glass door. I took one final deep breath, completely centering my mind and solidifying my absolute resolve. I pushed the door open and stepped into the brightly lit room. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, but my sudden presence immediately shattered the calm atmosphere. Megan looked up from the paperwork and her face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her expensive pen down onto the mahogany table, creating a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the glass walls. "What the hell are you doing here?" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely devoid of any professional restraint. She jumped up from her leather chair, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "I told you to stay away from here, you crazy old man," she yelled, completely losing her temper in front of the undercover federal agent. Terrence practically jumped out of his seat, his face turning even paler than before. "Dad," he stammered, his voice shaking terribly. "You cannot be here right now. You need to leave immediately before you ruin everything." Megan did not even let him finish his pathetic sentence. She turned her furious gaze toward the undercover agent and began issuing rapid demands. "Call the building security right this second," she ordered, her face turning bright red with extreme anger. "I want this senile old man removed from the premises by force if necessary. He has absolutely no legal right to be here, and he is trying to sabotage a highly sensitive real estate transaction." She looked back at me, her eyes burning with terrible hatred. "You are nothing but a massive burden, Warren," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You and Gloria are completely useless, and I am not going to let you destroy my financial future. Get out of my sight before I have the police arrest you for criminal trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood incredibly tall, my broad shoulders squared, facing her terrible wrath with the cold, silent strength of a man who held every single winning card. I looked at her flushed, angry face and felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard pity for the immense foolishness she was displaying. I remained completely silent, waiting for the final piece of the federal trap to smoothly fall perfectly into its designated place. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, breathing heavily while glaring at me with immense absolute hatred radiating from her entire tense body. I firmly refused to leave the room, quietly maintaining my ground with absolute, unbreakable, and silent confidence. The undercover federal agent raised his hand slowly, bringing a sudden halt to Megan's furious tirade. He looked directly at her with a perfectly measured expression of mild corporate annoyance. "There is absolutely no need for building security, Megan," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly persuasive. "We are handling a very massive transaction here today, and I prefer to keep things as quiet and professional as possible." He turned his head and looked at me, playing his part flawlessly. "In fact, I insist that he stays." The agent continued, turning his attention back to the terrible woman sitting across from him. "He is the previous patriarch of the property. I think it is only fitting that he remains here to personally witness the final transition of the estate. It adds a certain level of complete closure to the entire business deal. Do you not agree?" Megan stared at the agent for a brief second, completely stunned by his sudden request. She opened her mouth to argue, but then her eyes darted back to the thick stack of legal documents resting on the mahogany table. She remembered the massive $1.5 million wire transfer waiting for her signature. The blinding force of her extreme greed instantly overpowered her burning anger toward me. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and completely dismissed my presence with a careless wave of her hand. "Fine," she scoffed, her voice dripping with sheer arrogance. "If you want this pathetic old man to watch me take everything, then he can stand there and watch." She reached out and grabbed her fancy Mont Blanc pen. She pulled the fraudulent deed closer to her side of the table, leaning over the crisp white paper. The entire room suddenly held its breath. The pen hits the paper. The room was completely silent except for the faint humming of the air conditioning pushing cold air from the ceiling vents. Megan held the expensive black pen tightly in her right hand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. She leaned over the heavy mahogany table, staring at the crisp white pages of the fraudulent deed. She did not bother to read the dense legal paragraphs or the binding federal clauses printed in small black ink. She was blinded by extreme greed and the massive fortune she believed she was about to inherit. She pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line at the very bottom of the final page. I watched the dark ink flow from the pen, permanently staining the paper and officially binding her to the massive federal crime she was willingly committing. She wrote her name with a dramatic cursive, making the signature look as bold and arrogant as her personality. She pushed the documents across the polished wooden table toward my son. Terrence was sweating profusely, his pale face completely drained of any natural color. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, waiting for the executioner to pull the heavy lever. Megan glared at him, her bright blue eyes narrowing with sharp, aggressive impatience. "Sign the paper, Terrence," she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper echoing in the quiet room. "We do not have all day to sit here waiting for you to find courage. Sign the document right now so we can finally leave this place and start our real lives." Terrence slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the pen his wife had just discarded. He looked down at the signature line designated for the secondary witness. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was verifying a fraudulent transfer of property that did not belong to him. He knew he was helping his greedy wife steal a massive fortune while his own mother lay sick in a hotel room depending on a machine to breathe. He hesitated for one final agonizing second, the heavy weight of his crushing guilt completely paralyzing his hand. I stood there watching him, hoping against all hope that he would finally find the strength to drop the pen and walk away from this terrible betrayal. But Terrence was a fundamentally weak man, and his fear of his dominant wife was much stronger than his love for his own parents. He lowered his head completely, avoiding my gaze, and pressed the pen to the paper. He scribbled his signature right below hers, legally sealing his fate as a willing accomplice to a massive federal felony. He pushed the documents toward the center of the table and immediately pulled his hands back, resting them on his lap, as if the paper had suddenly burned his skin. The undercover federal agent sitting across from them smiled a calm, professional smile. He reached out and pulled the signed documents toward his side of the table. "Excellent," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly polished. He carefully inspected both signatures, ensuring they were clearly written and legally binding. "Everything appears to be in perfect order. I will have the title company process these physical documents immediately." He opened his sleek silver laptop and quickly typed a complex password to unlock the secure screen. He opened a highly secure banking application and navigated to the massive wire transfer portal. "I need to formally initiate the electronic funds transfer." "Right now," he explained, keeping his eyes locked on the bright screen. He carefully typed the exact bank routing numbers Megan had secretly created the day before. He entered the massive amount of $1,500,000. He paused for a brief second, hovering his finger directly over the heavy enter key. "Are we completely ready to finalize this transaction?" he asked, looking directly at Megan. She nodded her head vigorously, a massive greedy smile completely taking over her face. "Yes," she answered eagerly. "Send the money right now." The undercover agent pressed the heavy key. The digital command was instantly sent across the secure interstate financial network, permanently executing the fraudulent transaction. The digital ink was completely dry. For a few agonizing seconds, the room was perfectly still. Everyone was waiting for the digital financial system to process the monitored transfer. Megan sat on the edge of her leather chair, her hands tightly gripping the mahogany table. She was intoxicated by the terrible anticipation of becoming instantly wealthy. Terrence simply stared down at his shoes, looking completely miserable and defeated. Then a loud, sharp chime echoed through the quiet room. The sudden noise came directly from the designer purse resting on the table next to Megan. She gasped loudly and snatched her phone from the leather bag. Her hands were shaking with pure adrenaline as she unlocked the bright screen. I stood perfectly still, watching the terrible, greedy expression on her face rapidly shift from anxious anticipation to triumphant euphoria. She let out a loud, arrogant laugh that completely filled the quiet room. Her eyes were wide and practically glowing with immense, wicked satisfaction as she stared at the massive number displayed on her mobile banking application. "It is there," she announced, her voice trembling with intense excitement. "The entire deposit is sitting right there in my account. $1.5 million. She threw her head back and laughed again, a terrible, cruel sound that completely lacked any human warmth or basic decency. She turned her head and looked directly at me, her eyes burning with sheer arrogant superiority. She felt completely untouchable. She truly believed she had just outsmarted everyone and successfully stolen my entire life without facing a single consequence. "It is done, Warren," she said, a massive, cruel smirk stretching across her face. "The house belongs to the firm now. You have absolutely no rights left, and you have absolutely nowhere else to go. You have exactly 24 hours to return to that property and completely empty your pathetic garbage out of the basement. If you are not gone by tomorrow morning, I will personally call the city police and have you violently dragged off the premises for criminal trespassing. Do you completely understand me, old man? You are nothing now." Terrence closed his eyes tightly when she said those terrible words, but he did not speak up to defend me. He just sat there completely silent, validating her extreme cruelty with his cowardly compliance. I looked at the massive digital number glowing on her phone screen and felt a deep, cold sense of absolute victory wash completely over my tired soul. She had physically received the wire transfer across state lines. The terrible, massive crime was completely and officially finished. I did not respond to her cruel demands. I did not shout or raise my voice. I simply maintained a blank and incredibly cold expression, staring right through her as if she were invisible. My silence seemed to infuriate her even more. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult in my direction, but before she could speak a single word, the atmosphere inside the room dramatically shifted. The undercover federal agent sitting across the table calmly reached out and closed his silver laptop with a loud, definitive snap. He did not smile anymore. The warm, professional, corporate demeanor he had projected for the last 20 minutes completely vanished into the cold air. He slowly stood up from his leather chair, his tall frame completely dominating the space. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black electronic device. He pointed it directly at the heavy glass door and pressed a single red button. A loud, heavy electronic click instantly echoed through the room as the magnetic security lock engaged, permanently sealing the conference room door from the inside. Megan stopped laughing immediately. Her arrogant smile froze completely on her face as she heard the heavy door lock. The terrible sound was absolutely undeniable. It was the distinct heavy sound of a massive iron cage slamming completely shut. She looked at the agent, her blue eyes suddenly filling with deep, immense confusion and a sudden, sharp spike of genuine terror. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dropping to a nervous, trembling whisper. "Why did you just lock the door? We are completely finished here. We need to leave right now." The undercover agent did not answer her desperate questions immediately. He slowly walked around the edge of the large mahogany table, completely ignoring her rising panic. He positioned himself directly between Megan and the locked glass door, completely blocking her only possible route of escape. Terrence finally looked up from his shoes, his face instantly turning the color of wet ash as he realized something was terribly wrong. The temperature inside the secure glass room seemed to suddenly drop straight down to absolute zero. The heavy electronic click of the magnetic lock echoed through the room like the striking of a massive church bell. Megan stood frozen, her eyes darting from the locked door to the undercover agent who was now standing completely still. She took a step backward, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet, but there was absolutely nowhere for her to go. Terrence pushed his chair back, his breathing growing shallow and incredibly fast. The air inside the glass-walled conference room felt completely stagnant, choking the life right out of their arrogant lungs. "What is going on?" Megan demanded, her voice cracking with a sudden violent spike of genuine terror. "Open that door right now, or I will scream for the police." The undercover agent did not move a single muscle. "You do not need to scream for the police, Megan," he replied, his voice completely stripped of any corporate warmth. "They are already here." Before she could even process the heavy weight of his terrifying words, the frosted glass door suddenly vibrated violently. A deafening crash shattered the thick silence as a heavy steel battering ram smashed against the reinforced glass. The magnetic lock groaned and then violently gave way, tearing the heavy door right off its expensive metal hinges. The door flew open, slamming against the interior wall with a massive, terrifying explosion of sound. Megan screamed, a piercing, high-pitched sound of absolute horror, throwing her hands over her ears and backing away until her spine hit the far wall. Terrence fell out of his chair entirely, landing hard on his knees and scrambling blindly under the heavy mahogany table like a frightened child. 6 heavily armed federal agents stormed into the tight conference room, moving with terrifying, absolute precision. They wore dark olive tactical gear, heavy vests, and dark helmets. Large, bright yellow letters across their chests spelled out the letters FBI. They carried heavy black rifles, holding them tight against their shoulders as they completely flooded the room. "Federal agents, get your hands where I can see them," the lead agent roared, his booming voice completely dominating the chaotic space. "Nobody move a single muscle. Put your hands completely flat on the table right now." The undercover agent stepped back, leaning calmly against the window, completely out of the line of fire. I stood completely still in the corner of the room, watching the absolute destruction of my greedy enemies unfold exactly as I had planned. 2 massive agents immediately rushed toward Megan, grabbing her by the arms and spinning her around violently. She thrashed and kicked, screaming hysterically that she was a wealthy woman and that they were making a massive, terrible mistake. "Do not touch me," she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, terrible purple. "I have not done anything wrong. Get your filthy hands off my expensive dress. You do not know who you are dealing with." The agents ignored her desperate, pathetic cries entirely. They forced her arms behind her back, and I heard the loud, sharp ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs clamping down viciously tight around her perfectly manicured wrists. 2 other agents dragged Terrence out from under the heavy mahogany table. He was openly weeping, completely sobbing like a broken, pathetic animal. He offered absolutely zero physical resistance as they slammed him against the glass wall and cuffed his trembling hands behind his back. The absolute sheer panic radiating from their bodies was incredibly intoxicating to watch. They had completely destroyed my home, they had thrown my sick wife into a garbage bag, and they had tried to erase my entire existence. Now they were being treated like the dangerous, filthy criminals they truly were. The raid was violently fast and incredibly efficient, completely dismantling their arrogant lives in less than 60 terrifying seconds. The lead agent lowered his heavy black rifle and stepped directly into the center of the completely secured room. The chaos instantly subsided, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of my terrified son and his wicked wife. The federal agents maintained a completely tight perimeter, blocking the broken doorway and securing the entire floor of the expensive corporate building. Outside the shattered glass door, I could see confused, terrified office workers peering out from their cubicles, completely shocked by the massive, violent federal raid happening right in their premium workplace. Megan was breathing heavily, tears of pure rage and sheer terror streaming down her ruined makeup. "This is completely insane," she yelled, spitting her words at the lead agent. "You cannot do this to me. I just sold a house. I am a completely legitimate businesswoman. You are completely ruining my massive financial deal." The lead federal agent looked at her with an expression of absolute cold disgust. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a tightly folded piece of heavy white paper. He snapped it open and held it directly in front of her tear-stained face. "Megan Vance and Terrence Vance," he announced, his deep voice carrying the heavy, absolute weight of federal authority. "You are both currently under full federal arrest. You are officially charged with massive federal wire fraud, severe aggravated identity theft, and the deliberate defrauding of a federally protected disabled veterans housing charity." The heavy words hit the tight room like a massive physical shockwave. Megan stopped struggling instantly, her entire body freezing completely solid as the terrifying words echoed in her ears. "Defrauding a charity," she stammered, her voice completely losing all its arrogant venom, dropping to a weak, pathetic whisper. "What are you talking about? I did not steal anything from any charity. I sold a house. I sold my husband's family house." She desperately twisted her body, trying to look at me, standing quietly in the corner of the room. "Tell them, Warren," she screamed, her voice cracking wildly. "Tell these absolute lunatics that the house on Elm Street belongs to you. Tell them you gave it to Terrence. You signed the power of attorney. You gave us the legal right to sell your property. I am completely innocent." The undercover agent who had posed as the wealthy corporate buyer slowly shook his head and stepped forward. He reached down and picked up the fraudulent quitclaim deed from the mahogany table, holding it up for the lead agent to see. "She just signed the forged document right in front of me," the undercover agent confirmed cleanly. "And the massive wire transfer of $1.5 million successfully cleared into her personal bank account exactly 3 minutes ago. We have the absolute physical proof and the complete digital record of the massive felony." The lead agent nodded his head firmly. "You have the right to remain entirely silent," he began, reciting the warning with cold, robotic precision. "Anything you say can and absolutely will be used against you in a federal court of law." Megan shook her head violently, refusing to accept the terrifying absolute reality crashing down upon her head. "No!" she shrieked, thrashing her shoulders against the heavy grip of the federal agents. "This is a massive, terrible setup. The house belongs to that old man. It belongs to Warren." She pointed her cuffed hands blindly in my direction, her eyes completely wild and absolutely desperate. "Look at him," she yelled. "Make him tell the total truth right now." I slowly stepped out of the dark corner of the room, my heavy leather shoes sinking into the expensive plush carpet. I walked directly toward the heavy mahogany table, completely ignoring the federal agents standing all around me. I looked down at the forged legal documents scattered across the smooth, polished wood. Then I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into Megan's terrified, completely broken blue eyes. I rested my large, calloused hands flat against the table and leaned my heavy body slightly forward, bringing my face just a few inches away from hers. My voice was incredibly cold and completely empty of any human mercy. "I have not owned that house in 5 years, Megan." I stated the absolute devastating truth, cutting through the quiet room like a sharp, heavy blade. 5 years ago, Gloria and I legally donated the entire physical deed to a federal charity to build housing for crippled combat veterans. We only kept a legal life estate to live there until we die. When you forced Terrence to forge my signature and when you aggressively demanded that massive wire transfer today, you did not steal a single penny from me. You willingly and knowingly sold federal property. You stole $1.5 million directly from the United States government. Megan's jaw dropped completely open, her face turning completely perfectly white as the absolute sheer magnitude of her massive, unescapable mistake finally shattered her completely broken mind. She looked at me, then slowly turned her head to look at her husband, who was still sobbing weakly against the cold glass wall. "Terrence," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure, sudden, poisonous hatred. "It was his massive idea," she screamed, turning completely on my pathetic son immediately, in a desperate bid to save her own selfish and miserable life. The echo of my words hung in the cold air of the glass conference room, completely shattering the fragile illusion Megan had built around her greedy life. She stared at me, her face pale and twisted with a sudden, desperate realization that there was absolutely no escape from the federal trap. But instead of accepting responsibility for her massive crimes, she instantly lashed out like a trapped, vicious animal. She twisted her body against the heavy grip of the 2 federal agents holding her arms and turned her absolute fury directly onto her own husband. "It was his idea," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the frosted glass walls. "Terrence forced me to do all of this. He told me the house was his rightful inheritance, and he made me set up the bank account. I did not want to send his mother to that terrible state facility. He forged the medical documents himself and told me to sign the real estate papers today. He is a monster, and he lied to me about everything." Please, you have to believe me. I am a completely innocent victim in his sick, twisted scheme. I watched her completely betray the man she had sworn to love and cherish without a single ounce of hesitation. Her sheer cowardice was absolutely breathtaking to witness. She was willing to completely destroy her husband and throw him into a federal prison for the rest of his life just to save her own skin. Terrence was still kneeling on the plush carpet, his hands tightly cuffed behind his back. When he heard his wife accusing him of masterminding the entire federal conspiracy, his eyes went wide with pure agonizing shock. "Megan, how can you say that?" he cried, his voice cracking with immense pathetic despair. "You were the one who researched the real estate buyers. You were the one who demanded the massive wire transfer. You told me we needed the money for your consulting firm. I only signed the papers because you threatened to leave me if I did not support your financial vision." Megan sneered at him, her face completely devoid of any affection or loyalty. "Shut your mouth, Terrence," she hissed venomously. "You are a weak, pathetic man, and you dragged me down with you. I will testify against you in federal court. I will tell them everything you did to your own parents." The lead federal agent simply watched them tear each other apart with a look of supreme professional disgust. He did not care who blamed who, because he already had the absolute physical evidence linking both of them to the massive fraud. Terrence suddenly realized that his wife was completely gone. The woman he had abandoned his own family for was now actively handing him over to the federal authorities. The crushing weight of his terrible choices finally broke whatever small, pathetic piece of spirit he had left. He awkwardly shuffled his knees across the carpet, dragging his cuffed body directly toward me. Tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto his wrinkled suit jacket. He looked up at me with the desperate, terrified eyes of a lost child, completely ignoring the federal agents standing all around us. "Dad, please, you have to help me," he begged, his voice breaking into a loud, pathetic sob. "You have to tell them this is all a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we did not mean to steal from a charity. Tell them I am your son, and you gave me the permission to handle your estate. I will give all the money back right now. I will go to the hotel and apologize to Mom on my hands and knees. I will do anything you want, Dad. Just please do not let them take me to federal prison. I cannot survive in a place like that. Please, Dad, you are my father, and you have to protect me." I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. He was begging for the exact same protection he had completely denied his sick mother just a few days ago. He was crying for absolute mercy after showing absolutely zero mercy to the woman who gave him life. The sheer hypocrisy of his pathetic tears completely solidified the cold, hard block of ice that had finally replaced my completely broken heart. I stood there watching my own son drown in the shallow, miserable puddle of his own making without a single ounce of pity. I stared down at Terrence, my face completely devoid of any emotion. He was still sobbing loudly, his tears leaving dark, wet stains on the expensive carpet. I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not offer him a single word of paternal reassurance. Instead, I took one deliberate step closer, so I was standing directly over him, casting a long, dark shadow across his trembling shoulders. "You want me to protect you?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and completely steady. "You want me to tell these federal agents that this was all just a simple mistake?" Terrence nodded his head frantically, sniffing loudly. "Yes, Dad, please," he whimpered, looking up at me with pathetic hope shining in his wet eyes. "Just tell them you made a mistake with the paperwork. Tell them you forgot about the charity." I shook my head slowly, completely destroying his final, desperate illusion. "I did not make a mistake, Terrence," I said firmly. "You made a choice. You let your greedy wife pack your dying mother into a garbage bag and throw her out into the freezing rain. You stood in the kitchen and completely ignored me when I asked for your help. You actively signed a sworn legal document falsely declaring that I was losing my mind so you could steal the home I built with my own 2 hands. You chose money over your own flesh and blood. You chose absolute betrayal over loyalty." Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in pathetic denial. "I am sorry," he sobbed. "I am so sorry, Dad. I was just trying to secure a better future for us. I did not mean for any of this to happen." I leaned down slightly, ensuring he could clearly hear every single syllable of my final judgment. "There is no future for you anymore, Terrence," I told him, my voice turning to absolute ice. "You traded your future for a stolen federal asset. You let her throw your mother in the trash. I gave you every opportunity to walk away. I gave you a final warning in the garage, and you confidently told me to get out of your way. So that is exactly what I did. I stepped out of the way and let you destroy yourself. I am not your father anymore, Terrence. I am just a witness. I am the man who is going to sit in a federal courtroom and quietly watch the judge sentence you to prison." The absolute finality of my terrible words struck him like a physical blow. He collapsed entirely forward, burying his weeping face into the cold floor, completely broken and defeated by absolute truth. I turned my back on Terrence and slowly walked away from the mahogany table. The lead federal agent immediately stepped forward, barking sharp commands to his highly trained team. "Get them on their feet," the agent ordered, his voice echoing heavily in the shattered room. "We are transporting both suspects to the downtown federal holding facility right now." Two massive agents grabbed Terrence by his wrinkled jacket, hauling his weeping body roughly up from the expensive carpet. Another pair of agents grabbed Megan, completely ignoring her furious, panicked screams as they forcibly marched her toward the shattered glass doorway. I followed closely behind them, walking with steady, measured steps as they were aggressively pushed out of the secure conference room and into the bright, modern hallway. The entire corporate floor had come to a complete standstill. Dozens of wealthy executives and office workers were standing outside their glass cubicles, staring in absolute stunned silence. Megan desperately tried to hide her ruined face behind her shoulder, but it was completely useless. Everyone watched the incredibly arrogant woman in the bright red designer dress being paraded through the building like a dangerous common criminal. Terrence kept his head completely bowed, hiding his immense shame from the judging eyes of the wealthy crowd. They were shoved into the crowded elevator, descending rapidly toward the dark underground garage where the heavily armored federal transport vehicles were waiting. I stood quietly near the shattered conference room door, watching the steel elevator doors slide completely shut. The deafening, chaotic noise of the massive raid finally faded, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. They were completely gone. But the war was not entirely over yet. The brutal reality of the federal legal aftermath and the aggressive permanent asset seizure was just beginning to unfold before my eyes. I walked out of the towering glass corporate building and stepped back into the cold Chicago afternoon. The heavy gray clouds above were already threatening to unleash another freezing downpour over the city. I climbed into the cab of my old Ford truck and followed the dark, unmarked federal vehicles as they navigated through the heavy downtown traffic. We were heading back to the neighborhood I had called home for 40 years. We were heading back to Elm Street to begin the absolute physical dismantling of Megan's completely stolen life. Special Agent Miller had already dispatched a secondary asset forfeiture team to my property the moment the massive wire transfer had cleared and the arrests were officially made. When I turned my truck onto my quiet suburban street, I saw the immediate, incredibly satisfying results of federal justice in motion. The entire block was completely illuminated by the flashing yellow lights of a massive heavy-duty tow truck parked directly in front of my house. I pulled my truck to the curb and stepped out onto the damp pavement. Two federal agents wearing dark windbreakers were standing in my driveway, holding digital tablets and thick stacks of official seizure documentation. And right there in the center of the concrete driveway was the brand new jet black luxury Porsche SUV that Megan had arrogantly purchased just a few days ago. She had used the $60,000 she stole from my wife's medical fund to buy that beautiful, expensive machine. She had tossed me the keys and told me to wash the tires, treating me like a pathetic servant in my own front yard. Now the heavy steel hooks of the massive tow truck were securely attached to the front axle of the beautiful luxury vehicle. The hydraulic winch whined loudly as it slowly dragged the incredibly expensive car up the steep metal ramp. I stood on the sidewalk watching the heavy chains tighten completely, pulling her massive rolling ego away forever. Agent Miller walked over to me and handed me a copy of the official federal asset seizure warrant. He explained that every single item she had purchased using the stolen bank funds was being immediately confiscated by the United States government. The car was just the very first piece of her crumbling empire to be completely ripped away. She thought she was entirely untouchable, but the federal radar had been silently pinging that stolen vehicle from the exact moment she drove it off the luxury dealership lot. I watched the tow truck driver secure the heavy straps over the expensive tires and pull away from the curb, taking her stolen pride directly to a cold federal impound lot. The federal agents finished taking their comprehensive exterior photographs and quietly left the property, leaving me entirely alone, standing in front of my own home. I walked up the concrete driveway and stepped onto the front porch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the brass key she had forced me to use. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the completely silent house. The expensive staged furniture still sat in the living room, but it looked incredibly pathetic and hollow now. The terrible toxic energy that Megan had brought into this space was entirely gone, completely eradicated by the massive federal raid. But the physical cleansing of my home was not completely finished yet. I walked straight through the kitchen and opened the heavy fireproof door leading into the dark garage. I walked over to my old wooden workbench and picked up my heavy steel toolbox. I walked back to the front door and completely removed the shiny new lock that Terrence had installed just a few days prior. I replaced it with a heavy solid steel deadbolt securing the front entrance of my home from any future intruders. I went to the back door and did the exact same thing, methodically turning the heavy screws until the house was completely sealed and absolutely secure. Once the physical barriers were firmly in place, I needed to completely purge the inside of the house. I walked down the long hallway and entered the master bedroom. The room still smelled strongly of her expensive imported perfume. Her clothing was scattered across the bed and hanging neatly inside the large walk-in closet. She had purchased dozens of expensive designer dresses, luxury shoes, and high-end leather handbags using the money she believed she was going to make from the fraudulent real estate sale. She had completely moved her entire greedy life into my sacred personal space. I walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry, grabbing a large roll of heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. I brought them back into the master bedroom and snapped the first black bag completely open. I did not fold her expensive designer clothes. I did not treat her luxury silk fabrics with a single ounce of respect. I grabbed massive handfuls of her pristine, tailored dresses and shoved them violently into the dark plastic trash bag. I swept my arm across her expensive makeup vanity, knocking all her premium glass bottles and luxury cosmetic jars directly into another heavy black bag. I moved aggressively through the massive walk-in closet, grabbing her expensive imported leather shoes and tossing them haphazardly into the dark plastic sacks. I filled exactly 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags with every single physical possession she had left inside my home. I tied the thick plastic drawstrings completely tight, sealing her expensive worldly belongings inside the cheap dark plastic. I grabbed 2 of the heavy bags by the plastic necks and dragged them down the hallway, the rough material scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floors. I opened the heavy front door and dragged the black bags out onto the front porch. The gray clouds above finally broke open, unleashing a freezing heavy rain down upon the city of Chicago. I did not care about the bitter cold water soaking my flannel shirt. I went back inside and dragged the remaining 4 heavy garbage bags out onto the wooden porch. I piled the 6 dark plastic bags directly on top of each other, leaving them completely exposed to the freezing heavy downpour. I placed them in the exact same spot where I had found Gloria's oxygen tank and her beautiful wedding album just a few days ago. The absolute sheer poetic justice of the moment was incredibly satisfying to my tired soul. Megan had callously thrown my sick wife's entire life into the cold rain, treating her like absolute garbage. Now her own expensive designer clothes and luxury leather shoes were sitting in the exact same freezing puddle, getting completely ruined by the harsh, violent weather. The massive circle was entirely complete. I stood on the porch for a few long moments, watching the cold, heavy rain pound mercilessly against the cheap black plastic bags. The house was finally completely cleansed of her terrible, greedy sickness. I turned around and walked back inside, locking the heavy new steel deadbolt firmly behind me. The house was incredibly quiet, completely peaceful for the very first time in what felt like absolute years. I walked into the living room and grabbed a simple wooden chair from the dining table, placing it exactly where my favorite comfortable recliner used to sit. I sat down and looked out the large front window, watching the freezing rain wash away the remaining muddy footprints on the concrete driveway. I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute calm settling completely over my tired, weary bones. I had successfully protected my beloved wife, and I had completely dismantled the incredibly arrogant enemies who had tried to absolutely destroy us. My pocket suddenly began to vibrate loudly, completely breaking the heavy, peaceful silence in the room. I reached into my coat and pulled out my cell phone. The bright screen displayed a highly unusual notification. It was an automated message indicating an incoming collect call originating directly from the downtown Federal Detention Center. I stared at the glowing screen for a brief second, fully understanding exactly who was on the other end of the secure line. I slowly pressed the green button to accept the federal charges and brought the small phone up to my ear. The automated federal voice warned me that the call was being completely recorded and heavily monitored by the Bureau of Prisons. Then the line clicked open, and I immediately heard the loud, pathetic sound of desperate, violent weeping. "Warren," she cried, her voice completely unrecognizable and entirely broken by absolute immense terror. "Please, you have to help me, Warren." Megan was absolutely sobbing into the heavy plastic receiver, her previous arrogant superiority completely eradicated by the harsh, brutal reality of a federal holding cell. "They took my beautiful dress," she whimpered, crying so hard she could barely form a complete sentence. "They made me take off my clothes and they put me in this terrible orange uniform. It is incredibly cold in here, Warren. The walls are made of solid concrete and the other women in here are completely terrifying. You have to call your attorney right now and send the bail money. Please, Warren, you have to bail me out of this horrible place. I cannot stay in this freezing cell for another minute." I listened to her pathetic, desperate begging, completely unmoved by her endless, terrible tears. She was crying because she was cold. She was crying because she was uncomfortable. She had absolutely no remorse for what she had done to my sick wife. She was only sorry that she had finally been caught in her own massive federal trap. I sat in the quiet living room listening to the heavy freezing rain beating relentlessly against the front window of my fully secured home. I thought about Gloria shivering in that terrible rusted wheelchair at the state-run facility. I thought about the sheer, cruel arrogance Megan had displayed when she demanded the massive wire transfer and signed that forged federal deed. A slow, soft laugh entirely, completely escaped my lips. It was a cold, dark sound devoid of any warm human sympathy. "You should get very used to the freezing cold, Megan," I told her, my voice completely flat and absolutely indifferent to her massive suffering. "Because the federal government does not offer bail to massive flight risks who attempt to steal $1.5 million from crippled combat veterans. You are going to sit in that freezing concrete cell until the federal judge officially calls your name." I pulled the phone away from my ear, completely ignoring her sudden, desperate, panicked screaming, and pressed the red button terminating the secure connection forever. I dropped the phone into my pocket and leaned back in the hard wooden chair. The massive federal trial was rapidly approaching. The incredible heavy weight of the United States justice system was preparing to completely crush them. Would they stubbornly try to fight the absolute, undeniable evidence in open court, or would they completely break down and aggressively plead out to avoid spending the absolute rest of their miserable lives behind thick iron bars? 6 months passed since the cold, rainy afternoon when the massive federal raid completely shattered their arrogant lives. The brutal reality of the United States justice system moved incredibly slow, but it ground incredibly fine, crushing everything in its massive, heavy path. I walked into the downtown federal courthouse on a bright Tuesday morning wearing my absolute best dark suit. The heavy marble walls of the massive building echoed with the quiet, serious murmurs of lawyers and federal marshals. I took my seat in the front row of the heavy wooden gallery, resting my hands completely still on my lap. I was not there to testify today. I had already given my sworn extensive depositions to the federal prosecutors months ago. Today was the absolute final sentencing hearing. Today was the day the heavy iron gavel would finally fall and completely seal their terrible fates forever. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the massive courtroom swung slowly open. 2 large, armed federal marshals walked into the room, leading the heavily shackled prisoners directly toward the defense tables. My breath caught slightly in my chest when I saw them. The terrible physical toll of spending 6 months inside a cold concrete federal holding facility was absolutely undeniable. Megan walked into the bright courtroom completely stripped of her incredible wicked arrogance and her expensive designer clothes. She was wearing a cheap, incredibly baggy orange canvas jumpsuit that completely swallowed her shrinking frame. Her bright blonde hair was completely dull and entirely unwashed, hanging limply around her pale, sunken face. She looked like she had aged 20 terrible years in just 6 short months. Her hands were heavily cuffed at her waist, and she walked with a slight, pathetic shuffle, the heavy metal chains clinking loudly, echoing across the silent marble room. She did not look around the gallery. She kept her hollow, completely terrified eyes entirely fixed on the heavy wooden table in front of her. Terrence walked in right behind her. My only son looked entirely, completely broken. He was also wearing the same degrading bright orange prison uniform, his shoulders heavily slumped forward in absolute total defeat. He had lost a massive amount of weight, his cheekbones poking sharply through his incredibly pale skin. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, selfish man who had confidently told me to get out of his way in my dark garage. He looked like a frightened, beaten child who had finally realized there was absolutely no one left to save him from his own terrible choices. They sat down at the heavy defense tables, completely separated from each other by their expensive federal public defenders. They had turned completely against each other during the extensive federal investigation. Megan had desperately tried to blame the entire massive conspiracy on Terrence, hoping to secure a lighter prison sentence for herself. Terrence had aggressively retaliated, completely exposing her massive secret bank accounts and her terrible, cruel treatment of his sick mother. Their incredibly greedy marriage had completely violently exploded under the terrifying absolute pressure of the federal prosecutors, leaving them completely alone and entirely despised by absolutely everyone. The federal judge finally entered the massive courtroom. He was an older man with stern, deep-set eyes and a reputation for showing absolutely zero mercy to white-collar criminals. Everyone in the large room stood completely silent as the heavy judge took his seat behind the high wooden bench. He opened the thick, heavy file folder resting in front of him and stared completely silently at the two broken prisoners sitting below him. The federal prosecutor stood up and delivered a short, incredibly devastating summary of their massive, calculated crimes. He completely detailed how they had viciously targeted a sick, helpless woman, forcing her into a terrible state-run facility using completely forged legal medical documents. He meticulously explained how they had knowingly and aggressively attempted to steal a massive $1.5 million real estate asset completely belonging to a federally protected charity designed entirely to help severely disabled combat veterans. The prosecutor painted a perfectly clear, terrible picture of their absolute, unadulterated greed and their total lack of basic human empathy. Megan sat there quietly sobbing, her thin shoulders violently shaking under the cheap orange fabric, but absolutely no one in the courtroom felt a single ounce of pity for her. The heavy judge finally spoke, his deep voice resonating with absolute disgust and terrible authority. I have sat on this federal bench for 25 incredibly long years. He began, looking directly down at Megan and Terrence. I have sentenced violent criminals, dangerous drug traffickers, and incredibly ruthless mobsters. But the specific level of your moral bankruptcy is astonishing to me. You deliberately targeted a physically vulnerable, helpless elderly woman who had just suffered a massive stroke. You threw her entire fragile life into a black garbage bag and illegally dumped her in a severely underfunded state medical facility. You forcefully stripped a proud, honorable man of his legal dignity by forging his signature on sensitive documents. And you did all of this terrible destruction solely to steal an asset that belonged to a charity dedicated to housing disabled combat veterans who bled for this country. The judge paused, letting the heavy, terrifying weight of his righteous anger fill the silent courtroom. There is absolutely no excuse for your massive greed. He continued, his tone devoid of any human sympathy. There will be absolutely no leniency shown today. Megan Vance, please stand up immediately. Megan slowly pushed herself up from the heavy wooden chair, her thin legs trembling violently beneath her. She wept loudly, begging the strict judge for complete mercy, but the heavy wooden gavel slammed down hard, silencing her pathetic cries. For the massive crimes of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the deliberate defrauding of a federally protected veterans charity, I sentence you to serve 12 full years in a federal prison. The judge declared, his cold words striking her like a physical blow. She collapsed backwards violently, falling back into her heavy wooden chair, shrieking hysterically as the terrifying realization of her ruined future shattered her mind. The judge ignored her loud sobbing and immediately turned his dark, intense eyes directly onto my broken son. Terrence Vance, please stand up immediately, the judge aggressively demanded. Terrence stood up slowly, keeping his hollow, defeated eyes glued to the hard wooden floor. You are a weak, cowardly excuse for a man, the strict judge told him directly, stripping away whatever tiny shred of pride Terrence still possessed. You willfully stood by and actively assisted this greedy woman as she systematically destroyed your own sick mother. You are equally legally responsible For your active, willing participation in this massive federal conspiracy, I sentence you to serve 7 full years in a federal penitentiary." Terrence did not cry out loud. He simply nodded his heavy, tired head, accepting his devastating punishment without a single word of protest. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down one final time, echoing loudly throughout the massive, silent courtroom. The formal federal sentencing hearing was completely finished. The 2 armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward and grabbed Terrence and Megan roughly by their slumped arms, preparing to lead them away to begin their long, miserable years of forced incarceration. As they were being pulled away from the heavy defense tables, Terrence suddenly stopped and turned his head. He looked back over his shoulder, searching the quiet wooden gallery until his terrified, hollow eyes finally found mine. He stood there for a brief, fleeting second, the heavy metal chains around his wrists rattling softly in the silent room. He looked at the man who had worked double shifts in a boiling steel mill to feed him. He looked at the father he had completely viciously betrayed for a greedy, terrible woman who was now screaming hysterically beside him. His lips slowly moved, forming the words, "I am sorry," without making a single sound. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the wooden gallery. I did not nod my head. I did not blink my eyes. I did not offer him a single ounce of final paternal forgiveness. I simply stared back at him with a completely cold, empty expression until the armed marshals aggressively pulled him through the heavy wooden side doors, completely removing him from my life forever. I slowly stood up from my seat and buttoned my dark suit jacket. The immense, heavy burden I had been carrying for the last 6 months finally lifted entirely from my tired, weary shoulders. I turned my back on the empty defense tables and walked confidently down the long center aisle of the massive marble courtroom. I pushed open the heavy main doors and stepped outside into the bright, beautiful Chicago sunlight. The air felt incredibly fresh and clean. The brutal war was completely over. It was time for my real life to finally peacefully resume. I drove my old Ford truck back to the downtown hotel on a quiet Saturday morning. The city was finally still, and the heavy gray clouds had cleared away, leaving a soft, golden light over the streets. I walked up to the high-end suite and found Gloria sitting by the window. She was dressed in her favorite green sweater and her hair was pinned back exactly the way she liked it. When she saw me walk through the door, she did not have to ask a single question. She saw the peace in my eyes and the strength in my posture. I knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "It is over, baby," I told her softly. "We are going home." I checked her out of the hotel and carefully helped her into the truck. We drove back to our neighborhood, passing the familiar parks and the old steel mill where I had spent my life. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. There were no luxury cars blocking the path and no aggressive staging signs in the grass. The black garbage bags filled with Megan's expensive clothes were gone, hauled away by the city waste management. I carried Gloria over the threshold and placed her gently into her favorite armchair. I had spent the previous night restoring the living room to its original state. I moved the sterile, modern furniture into the garage and brought back her knitting table and my worn leather recliner. The house no longer smelled like fresh chemical paint, it smelled like home. I walked into the bedroom and set up her oxygen concentrator right next to the bed, exactly where it had sat for months. I organized her pill bottles in the wooden cabinet I built for her years ago. Everything was in its right place. The silence in the house was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was a healing silence. Gloria looked around the room and let out a long, contented sigh. She reached out and touched the lace doily on the arm of her chair, and I saw a single tear of relief roll down her cheek. She was no longer a ward of the state or a burden to be managed. She was the queen of her castle once again. I spent the afternoon cooking a slow meal of collard greens and cornbread, letting the warm, familiar aromas fill every corner of the kitchen. We ate together in the dining room, watching the shadows grow long across the backyard. The terror of the last few weeks began to fade into a distant memory, replaced by the quiet dignity of a life reclaimed. But our home was not just going to be a sanctuary for the two of us anymore. The battle with Megan and Terrence had opened my eyes to a much larger purpose. I had realized that our house was a fortress, and that other veterans needed a fortress of their own. On Monday morning, I met with the directors of the Disabled Veterans Housing Trust. We sat at my kitchen table and signed a formal partnership agreement that changed the future of our property forever. Because the house was already legally owned by the trust, we decided to accelerate their plans while Gloria and I were still living there. We spent the next month converting the massive lower floor and the walk-in basement into a fully accessible support center for wounded combat veterans in the Chicago area. We installed a state-of-the-art physical therapy room and a quiet lounge where young men and women returning from overseas could find the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. I spent my mornings working alongside the contractors, ensuring every ramp and every handrail was installed with the same precision I used at the steel mill. Gloria took on a new role as well. She sat in the sunroom and helped coordinate the volunteer schedules and the community outreach programs. Our home became a hub of life and service. We saw young soldiers who had lost limbs or struggled with the invisible wounds of war walking through our front door. They did not see an old man and a sick woman. They saw mentors. They saw a family that understood the meaning of sacrifice and the necessity of honor. This was our new normal. We were no longer just surviving the betrayal of our son. We were building a legacy that would outlive us both. The house on Elm Street was no longer just a piece of real estate to be liquidated. It was a lighthouse. Every time I heard the sound of a veteran laughing in the lower lounge or the clank of physical therapy weights, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. We had taken the absolute worst intentions of a greedy woman and turned them into a foundation of hope for people who truly deserved it. As the months turned into a year, the seasons began to shift once again. I found myself sitting on the front porch on a warm autumn evening watching the sun dip below the Chicago skyline. The orange and purple hues of the sunset reflected off the windows of the houses down the block. I watched a young veteran named Marcus wheel himself down the new custom ramp I had built for him. He waved at me, and I gave him a respectful nod. Gloria was inside resting after a busy afternoon of hosting a garden club meeting for the neighborhood. I felt a deep, unshakable peace in my heart. I had fought the hardest war of my life right here on this porch, and I had won. My phone did not ring with collect calls from the jail anymore because I had blocked those numbers months ago. I had no desire to hear the excuses of a woman who valued a Porsche over a human life. Suddenly, the mail carrier walked up the driveway and handed me a small stack of envelopes. I sorted through the utility bills and the charity newsletters until I reached the bottom of the pile. My breath hitched for a split second. The envelope was made of cheap thin paper and bore a heavy purple stamp from a state correctional facility. I recognized the cramped, shaky handwriting on the front immediately. It was from Terrence. I sat there holding the letter in my calloused hand. I could feel the weight of his regret and his desperate need for forgiveness radiating through the paper. He had been in prison for over a year now, and this was likely another attempt to beg for a relationship that he had personally set on fire. I looked at the return address and thought about the night in the garage when I gave him every chance to be a son. I thought about the way he looked away while his wife tat his mother and stole her medicine. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a cold finality. I stood up from my chair and walked into the house. I went to the fireplace where a small warm fire was crackling in the hearth. I did not open the envelope. I did not read his words of sorrow or his promises to change. I simply held the letter over the dancing orange flames for a moment before letting it go. I watched the paper curl and blacken as the fire consumed his handwriting. The smoke rose up the chimney and vanished into the night air. There was no more room in this house for betrayal or the people who facilitated it. I walked back to the master bedroom and checked on Gloria. She was sleeping soundly, the oxygen machine humming a steady, comforting rhythm in the dark. I climbed into bed beside her and closed my eyes. The house was safe. My wife was protected. The order of the world had been restored by the hand of a man who refused to be broken. I fell asleep with the absolute knowledge that justice was not just a word in a book. It was the life I was living every single day. Moral of the story: respect is the foundation of any family, and once you trade that respect for greed, you lose the right to call yourself a son or a daughter. A quiet man is not a weak man. He is simply a man who understands that the loudest storms often pass quickly, while the deep roots of integrity remain standing. I did not destroy Terrence and Megan. I simply held up a mirror and let them be destroyed by the reflection of their own ugly hearts. True wealth is not found in a bank account or a luxury vehicle. It is found in the peace of a home where love is a sacred promise and honor is the only law that matters. Never mistake a father's patience for a father's blindness, because once the fire of a quiet man is lit, it will burn away the rot until only the truth remains. The sun is finally setting over the Chicago skyline, casting a warm, golden glow across the front porch of the house I have owned for 40 years. I sit here in my old wooden chair, the one Megan tried to throw away, and I listen to the sounds of a house that is finally at peace. Below me on the ground floor, I can hear the muffled sounds of life. There is the steady rhythm of a treadmill and the light clanking of weights. A group of young veterans is downstairs, men and women who gave their bodies for this country just like I did once. They are rebuilding their lives in the space where Megan wanted to host cocktail parties and build a consulting firm. It brings a deep, quiet satisfaction to my soul to know that the rooms once filled with greed and betrayal are now filled with hope and recovery. Gloria is inside, resting in her favorite chair with the lace doily I recovered from the muddy driveway. She is breathing easily, her strength returning a little more with every sunset. We do not talk about the storm that nearly destroyed us. We do not need to. The silence in our home is a beautiful thing now, a sacred space where the ghosts of our son's cowardice can no longer reach us. I think back to that first night in the freezing rain. I remember the weight of the black trash bags and the way my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Megan and Terrence truly believed they had won. They looked at a 73-year-old man and saw a relic, a broken tool that was no longer useful. They thought my silence was a sign of defeat. They had no idea that while I was scrubbing the floors and wearing that cheap maintenance shirt, I was calculating every single move of their destruction. I did not need to yell. I did not need to throw a single punch or raise my voice in anger. Violence is for men who have run out of options, and I had a whole world of legal options at my fingertips. I dismantled their entire lives with the absolute precision of a master machinist. Every document I filed and every secret I kept was a calculated strike. I protected my wife, I protected my dignity, and most importantly, I protected the legacy that Gloria and I wanted to leave behind. There is a special kind of peace that comes from knowing you have done what was necessary. I did not seek revenge, I sought justice. There is a massive difference between the two. Revenge is messy and emotional, but justice is clean and permanent. When I watched the federal marshals drag them out of that office, I did not feel joy. I felt a profound sense of closure. The house is full of life again, and it is the right kind of life. It is a life built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. The veterans who live and train here call me Mr. Vance, and they say it with a tone that Megan could never understand. They understand that honor is not something you can buy with $1 million wire transfer. It is something you earn through decades of hard work and staying true to the people you love. I remember the letter from the prison that arrived last week. The paper was thin and cheap, just like the promises Terrence used to make. I held it in my hand for a long time, looking at his handwriting. I could have read his excuses. I could have listened to him blame Megan for everything that happened. But I chose not to. I walked over to the fireplace and let the flames take it. Watching that paper turn to ash was the final step of my journey. It was the moment I realized that I no longer owed him anything. Not my anger, and certainly not my forgiveness. He made his choice in the garage that night, and now he has to live with the permanent consequences of that choice. Life moves on, and it moves on without the people who are willing to throw it away for a quick payday. I look out at the street and see the neighborhood lights coming on. The world is exactly as it should be. The greedy are gone, the innocent are safe, and the legacy of this house is secure for the next generation of heroes. This is the ultimate closure. I look at the brass plaque near the front door that bears the name of the Veterans Trust. It shines in the moonlight, a permanent reminder that this house belongs to something much larger than one man's ego. I think about the many double shifts I worked to pay off this mortgage, the sweat and the grime of the steel mill that paid for every brick and every board. Megan thought she could just erase all that history with a forged signature. She thought her modern world of digital wire transfers and companies was more powerful than the roots I had planted here. She was wrong. She underestimated the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose but his honor. I am Warren Vance, and I am the master of my own fate. I have proven that the truth does not need to scream to be heard. It only needs to wait. My home is now a sanctuary for those who have sacrificed, and that is a victory that no amount of stolen money could ever achieve. I am content. People mistake silence for weakness, assuming an old man has forgotten how to fight. But the fiercest battles aren't won with screaming matches or raised fists. They are won with patient strategy and a ruthless understanding of the law. I didn't destroy their lives, I simply handed them the shovel and let their own greed dig a federal grave. Respect is mandatory, and honor is a life estate that no one can take away. If you believe that justice should always prevail for the elders who built our world, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of true justice, and share your thoughts in the comments below.